Hidden among silent plains, underwater trenches, and forgotten mountains are secrets that defy the conventional wisdom. People discover columns carved deep into the earth, vanished islands, strange sounds in the sand, and traces of masters whose skills surpass ancient understanding. These mysteries seem torn from another era, preserving a sense of hidden power that still lingers beneath the layers of time. Underground Hall of Amudama. Hidden beneath the rugged slopes of the northern coast is a place long considered a mere invention of the ancients, though their tales of tall columns and cold stone sounded too certain to be mere fantasy. It was only when a group of explorers descended into one of the chasms that they saw the entrance to a space unlike any ordinary cave, as if someone had once expended enormous effort to create a hall where the walls did not follow the chaotic lines of nature. Silence reigned within, so thick that footsteps sounded like blows on empty vessels, and the light from the lanterns glided over perfectly smooth surfaces, leaving the feeling that the stone had not weathered for centuries, but had been hewn with a precision impossible for the ancient tribes that could have lived in these places. And the deeper the researchers went, the stronger the impression became that the space was not simply hewn, but built according to a strict plan, where every line was subordinated to a single thought. The hall stretched for dozens of steps, and on both sides rose columns so smooth that they seemed cast in an invisible mold, although the local rocks do not allow such smoothness to be achieved without lengthy processing. And the strangest thing was that the columns did not support the vault in the usual sense, but stood as independent objects, as if they were intended for another task related to resonance, light, or the movement of sound. In the farthest sections, the walls began to reflect whispers, as if each word passed through several layers of echo, creating a sense of the presence of something large, hidden beyond the line of sight, as if there were voids in the massif that responded to the slightest vibration, although no passages were found there, and the instruments showed only ordinary stone. But the acoustics themselves baffled the researchers. The surface of the columns was particularly striking, with traces of identical notches visible on them, diverging vertically in thin stripes, reminiscent of marks left by a tool working at an unusual speed, as if someone had passed over the stone hundreds of times with the same movement, without deviating even a fraction, and at the same time maintaining the same rhythm, something impossible for manual processing, especially in the low light conditions that ancient people might have had. Some scholars have suggested that the hall may have been used as a storage space, but the lack of niches, signs, and characteristic recesses refutes this idea, while others have said that rituals were held here, although no traces of fires, meetings, or ancient symbols have been found, which makes this version too bold, since the space is too large and too precise to serve only as a place of worship. The strangest thing was the entrance, which seemed too narrow for such a huge space, as if the real doors were located somewhere higher up and were lost in the collapses. And when the team tried to scan the upper layers, they found massive sections of stone with an unusual density, as if there was a second level or a blocked corridor hidden underneath. But the instruments showed too blurry data to accurately determine their nature. Local residents said that as children, they heard a low humming sound from the sinkholes, like a distant voice. Although the sounds no longer repeat, this suggests that, in times when the earth was drier, water channels could have run beneath the hall, creating vibrations. However, even this theory does not explain the evenness of the columns and the smoothness of the walls, which seem to have been created by the hands of masters whose abilities exceeded those of known cultures. Today, the Amudama Hall remains a mystery without clear answers, and each new visit brings the feeling that the space awaits someone who can decipher its hidden meaning, as if the stone holds the memory of people who knew how to work with the material differently than anyone we know. And no one can say whether it will ever become clear why this hall was built and why its creators left, leaving behind such a perfect and silent space. The disappearance of the ice eagle. As the long-awaited clear weather began to appear in the northern seas, the observation station received a final, brief signal from the vessel, which had been conducting research in the ice for several weeks. This signal sounded confident, as if the crew had no idea that in a few hours communication would be cut off abruptly, leaving only a shaky trace of the route, heading towards areas where the winter wind seemed to hide any attempts to find traces of people. The ship's route passed through an area where ice fields move faster than charts can record them, creating enormous cracks that can close and open in minutes, as if the Earth itself were breathing beneath a layer of white crust. Small groups of explorers are lost there every year, but the Ice Eagle's disappearance was particularly special, as the ship was equipped to withstand extreme pressures, and the crew had the experience for several expeditions. When the search mission reached the suspected area, the ice lay flat as if someone had smoothed the surface, and there was no debris, no traces of fuel, no stains indicating damage, as if the ship had simply vanished, vanishing into thin air, although such stories are usually found only in legends and not in the reports of rescue services. And this led the team to believe that the real cause was hidden deeper than it seemed. One observer noticed a huge mass of fog near the route, seemingly hanging above the surface without changing shape. This seemed strange, since fog in northern latitudes is usually unstable, constantly moving, rising, or settling. Here, however, it retained clear edges, as if it were part of a hidden structure associated with temperature dips that instruments detect only at narrow points. As the search team approached, a strange sound emerged from within the fog, like a low growl, as if the ground beneath the ice was vibrating, and this vibration could be felt through the shoes, penetrating inward so that it became difficult to determine the direction, but the sound was too deep to be a threat. Although it was at this moment that the station received a weak signal, similar to an attempt to establish communication, as if someone was transmitting a message but could not break through a thick layer of interference. The searchers decided to explore the area beneath the ice and discovered a strange cavity, not noted in any of the previous reports, and this cavity was too smooth, as if someone had cut it out of the ice without leaving any tools or damaging the structure of the walls, which is impossible even with modern methods, since ice usually breaks roughly, forming sharp edges. But here, the surface was smooth, as if polished. Some experts suggested that this cavity could have formed as a result of a warm current, but the temperature showed stable values that do not allow for such a process. And this means that the formation occurred for another reason, which remains unknown, since no signs of natural emissions or phenomena were found there, although similar cavities were found in ancient glaciers, but they disappeared under the pressure of centuries-old layers. There were rumors that the crew of the Ice Eagle could have gone into this cavity, but this is impossible because the entrance is too narrow and no ship could have entered it, which means that the disappearance is not connected with the ice collapse, and one can only think that the ship left the area in a direction that no one was able to track, although this contradicts the last signals because the coordinates were stable, and then the connection was cut off as if someone cut it off intentionally. The expedition is now considered one of the most mysterious in the northern latitudes, and even after many years, reports of the disappearance raise questions that have no clear explanation. After all, any ship leaves a trace when it crashes, but here there was nothing but a strange cavity and a quiet hum under the ice, which observers heard for a long time, as if the Earth held within itself the memory of those who had vanished, leaving only a void on the white map of the icy ocean. Sahara spirals. When the first high-altitude photographs of the desert began to reveal hidden forms beneath layers of sand, researchers saw lines among the monotonous dunes that repeated each other too stubbornly. And these lines formed large spirals, as if someone had once created enormous symbols on the surface that were not intended to be seen from below. After all, standing on the ground, it is impossible to see a regular outline. It is revealed only from above, where the desert becomes a map of an unknown hand. Each spiral stretched for dozens of steps and consisted of perfectly rounded segments, leaving the impression that the sand had been deliberately shifted. But all attempts to explain this by the wind turned out to be too weak, because the wind creates chaos, leaving jagged shapes. But here, each curve looked thoughtful, as if it were created step by step, maintaining the correct distance and not allowing displacement, which is impossible for natural forces acting randomly. The strangest thing was that the spirals repeated themselves at great distances from each other, as if there was a single system between them, built according to a rule known only to its creators. And if you draw lines between the centers, you can see a figure similar to an elongated polygon, although the desert has never been famous for geometry, especially on such a scale, because there every step is erased by the sand faster than a person can leave a trace. Some archaeologists have suggested that stone foundations might be hidden beneath the spirals, but when several expeditions have tried to reach the lower layers, they have found only dense sand layers, as if something heavy had once been pressed into shape. But then the structure disappeared, leaving only an imprint, too smooth to be accidental, and too deep to have been created simply by wind movements. Locals reported that during certain seasons, low sounds could be heard at night above the spirals, as if the sand were vibrating under the pressure of hidden air currents. Although instruments did not record any significant changes, this created the feeling that the vibrations might be related not to nature, but to the very structure of the sand, which seemed to preserve the remnants of ancient movements, left in the lower layers from a time when the climate was milder and the earth firmer. Several experts suggested that the spirals could have been landmarks for ancient travelers, but this theory was quickly dismissed as the spirals are too large to be mere signs along the way, and too labor-intensive to have been created by people moving through the desert without sophisticated tools. Aligning dozens of circles requires strength that neither the tribes nor the early farmers who lived in the surrounding oases possessed. However, desert legends have long suggested that long before the lands dried out, there were those who knew how to work stone as a soft material, and that it was they who left traces that the desert tried to swallow but could not completely hide. If this legend is even slightly close to reality, then the spirals may be the remains of a vast map that was distributed across the land as precisely as patterns on fabric. Some researchers have attempted to create digital elevation models and have seen that in several places within the spirals, the surface forms small elevations, as if the bases of columns or platforms were hidden there. But when they attempted to excavate, the sand sank, closing all passages, leading to the idea that there is a soft layer beneath the surface that reacts to intervention, and therefore the structure remains hidden, preventing access to possible foundations. Today, the Sahara spirals remain one of those mysteries that feel secure in the hands of wind and time, and even if research goes deeper, no one can say whether they will provide direct answers, for the desert knows how to keep secrets, leaving man with only contours and shadows, turning every attempt to explain them into a new hypothesis, while the spirals themselves continue to lie among the sands, as if waiting for a gaze capable of seeing more than the lines on the surface. Crystal Towers of Bolivia. When the first travelers reached the high plateaus lying between the mountain ranges, they saw strange formations among the rocky slopes, which at first they mistook for ordinary rocks, but the closer they got, the clearer it became that before them stood structures resembling elongated towers, not assembled by human hand, but also not resembling natural formations, because their shape was too smooth, and the edges glowed with a slight iridescence, as if drops of dawn color had frozen inside. These towers rose to varying heights, some just barely above the ground, while others towered above a man's height, and each had many facets, polished to such a degree that the light was scattered into thin stripes, reflected at unexpected angles, creating the impression that the towers were assembled from many fine crystals that had somehow merged into a single monolith, leaving no seams or traces of connection. The strangest thing was that these formations were arranged in groups, as if repeating the order that existed before people arrived in these places. As if this territory had once served as a point connected to the movement of the sun or the transitions between seasons, and if you stand between the towers at a certain moment, you can see how the light passes along the edges and almost draws one common line, as if connecting them into a single figure. Some researchers suggested that the source could have been ancient hot springs, which, with prolonged activity, created a mineral that grew in layers. But this version did not explain the smooth geometry, because natural deposits always produce unevenness, cracks, and rough transitions. And here the surface was so precise, as if it had been leveled with an instrument that allowed it to maintain the same depth at every centimeter. In one area where the towers are particularly close, a faint hum was detected, barely perceptible to the ear but felt by the skin, as if a quiet vibration were occurring within the crystals, caused by the wind, and this vibration could have been part of a structure that once served a specific purpose, perhaps related to the transmission of sound or the accumulation of solar heat, since crystals are capable of holding energy and releasing it at a slow pace. Some locals have reported that in the early hours of the morning, the crystals glow with a soft warmth, though instruments do not register a rise in temperature, creating the impression that the light becomes part of the surface, reflecting as if the towers were empty inside. However, no attempt to shine a strong beam of light through them has revealed any cavities, suggesting that the structure inside is denser than it appears, as if each crystal has the ability to retain light rather than let it through. When a team of researchers decided to measure the composition of the crystals, they discovered traces of minerals that occurred deep below the surface, which raises questions, as such elements are rare at this altitude, meaning either the towers grew from deeper layers or there was a process in the area that brought the minerals to the surface, but did so too gently to destroy the perfectly smooth edges. More daring theories claim that the towers could have appeared during a period when the climate of these places was very different from the current one, and when the Earth was just beginning to change shape. If we believe the legends preserved by local tribes, the crystals were considered a transition between worlds, and if a person stood in the center of a group of towers in silence, he could hear a sound similar to a whisper, although many believe that this is just a play of the wind that passes between the edges. But the most amazing thing is that the towers continue to grow, albeit slowly, because each year the faces become a little higher, as if the structure is alive and not just standing, and this process cannot be explained by the usual accumulation of sediments, because sediments do not follow straight lines, but here each layer lies as if it maintains the previous shape without breaking the symmetry, which makes this mystery one of the most difficult to explain. Today, the Crystal Towers remain a place rarely visited by travelers, as the path there is difficult, but those who come always say they feel a sense of silence and a strange calm, as if the space holds the memory of a time when the Earth was different, and no one can say what these crystals hide or why they continue to grow among the dry stones of the high plateaus. Labyrinth of Calabria. When fishermen on the south coast noticed that the water in one of the bays had become unusually clear, they initially assumed it was just a rare day without wind, but when the sunlight sank deeper than usual, they saw the outlines of smooth lines beneath the smooth surface that resembled walls. And that's when talk began that the sea had once again uncovered something old, something that had lain beneath the surface for a long time, hiding its shape. When the divers first descended, they saw a structure like a huge corridor, where the walls ran parallel, as if someone had once built a path that was not intended for the sea, and the further they went, the more clearly it became that these were not random rocks, for every edge was too smooth and the angles too clear to be the result of an ancient collapse or the long play of waves. The labyrinth consisted of several levels, and the depth of each level varied so little that it seemed as if the builders were striving for perfect symmetry, although it is unknown whether it was people or forces that used methods that do not fit into the usual ideas of ancient construction, because the walls were too smooth and the transitions between sections too precise, as if the space had been carved out by a huge tool, leaving no chips or traces of work. Particularly impressive were the long, straight corridors, which ran so smoothly that divers could move without changing direction until the light disappeared into the depths. And in these corridors, weak currents of water sometimes arose, like a breath, as if the space were living and slowly exhaling under the pressure of the ocean. although in these places there were no underwater springs or cracks through which such a flow could pass. Some experts suggested that the labyrinth could have been part of an ancient settlement that sank underwater after a strong earthquake, although this theory did not explain the smoothness of the walls and the lack of debris, as any destruction leaves chaos, while here a clear form was observed, as if the complex had been built in a single style, and even those areas that looked damaged had smooth edges, as if the destruction had not occurred naturally. Throughout the labyrinth, there were stone slabs lying at an angle, and the surface of these slabs was covered with thin lines that resembled the notches of a tool, repeating at the same pitch. This uniformity led researchers to believe that the slabs once served as supports or part of a ceiling. But no theory explains why such a huge complex was needed and why it was built in a place where, over time, underwater sinkholes inevitably appear. Some locals said they had long heard stories of a sunken part of the land where houses and stone platforms once stood, but these stories were too vague to form the basis for analysis. Although one old man recalled that his grandfather spoke of a stone that sings underwater, and when divers touched some of the walls, they actually heard a quiet, vibrating echo, as if the stone were responding to the touch by storing the sound within itself. The strangest thing was that in some places on the walls there were narrow vertical channels leading upwards, but ending in even cuts, as if they had once reached the surface and were then blocked by a collapsed layer. And if we imagine that the labyrinth was once above ground, or partially below it, one might think that the channels served as an outlet for air or light, but no theory has been confirmed. When a team of researchers tried to map it, they realized that the structure was not chaotic, as the corridors connected at angles that formed a complex network-like pattern, and this network looked as if it had been created using knowledge of the flow directions as the water flowed through the labyrinth strangely smoothly, without creating strong turbulence, as if the space was designed to allow movement without resistance. Today, the Calabria Labyrinth is considered one of the most mysterious underwater complexes, because no theory explains it with complete certainty, and everyone who has been immersed in it says that inside there is a sense of alien logic, which cannot be touched directly, but which can be felt in every line, in every turn, in every quiet echo that rises from the bottom, as if reminding that the labyrinth holds a history that no one can yet read. Catatumbo lightning. As the still night rose over the lake, it seemed as if the dark water absorbed every sound, but soon faint flashes began on the horizon, like the breath of a distant flame, and these flashes grew brighter until the sky opened up into a multitude of fiery lines that rose above the clouds, as if someone were setting the air on fire again and again, creating an eternal thunderstorm that continued almost without interruption. Lightning flashed so frequently that the sky seemed to have no time to darken, and a special structure could be discerned in these bright discharges, because the flashes did not appear randomly, but precisely repeated the zones above the water, as if invisible lines directed them along the same route, and observers noticed that each discharge lasted a little longer than usual, leaving a trace similar to a thin, fiery corridor, which disappeared as quickly as it appeared. When expeditions attempted to approach the center of the phenomenon, they saw that the air there was denser, as if filled with hidden moisture, and they felt a slight tremor, as if the space were under tension, although the instruments showed calm. This difference between sensation and measurement led to the idea that the source of the phenomenon was hidden deeper than it seemed, perhaps connected with the features of the earth under the lake, which affect the movement of air and create conditions for the appearance of bright lines of light. Some researchers said that thunderstorms were caused by warm currents rising from the surface and colliding with cold masses. But this theory did not explain why the outbreaks occurred almost every day, as if nature had found a way to maintain a thunderstorm that never ended, and even on days of complete silence, discharges still occurred, as if someone had turned on an invisible mechanism that worked regardless of the season. Locals said that lightning served as a guide for them, because even on the darkest night it illuminated the way, and they said that the flashes were like signs left by ancient powers that lived in the mountains. But these stories have no clear origins, and yet rumors of mysterious silhouettes that sometimes appear in the light of the discharges make people look at thunderstorms with respect, as if they were part of something that stands above simple weather. The closer the observers approached the zone of maximum activity, the stronger the wind became, and the strange thing was that the wind did not flow horizontally, as usual, but seemed to rise from the ground itself, pushing the clouds to the same place where lightning was born with particular force. And this moving flow created the feeling that the space above the lake was opening a door through which energy was passing. Research showed that the light from the lightning reached enormous heights, and each flash could be seen for many kilometers, illuminating the night landscape so intensely that it seemed like day had broken for a moment. But the strangest thing was that the sound was delayed, as if the lightning had occurred in another part of space, and its echo arrived later, passing through dense air, which seemed to hold the vibrations, creating a lingering tremor. If you stand on the shore and watch a thunderstorm for a long time, you can notice that some flashes are repeated at the same points, as if someone is drawing an invisible figure, and this figure seems to live its own rhythm, which is not connected with the storms, because in calm weather the flashes continue the pattern, preserving the form so precisely that it seems as if the atmosphere is subject to them, although no one knows what directs their movement. Some scientists have attempted to map the discharges, but the lines have often formed a disorder that cannot be explained by human notions of weather cycles. And this illogical form makes one wonder if the Catatumbo lightning is not just a natural phenomenon, but part of a deep process that occurs within the earth, water, and air simultaneously, linking them into a single system, completely hidden from direct observation. Today, the eternal thunderstorm remains one of the most mysterious events on the planet, because no single explanation can encompass all of its features, and each time the night over the lake flares up with a new discharge, there is a feeling that it does not simply illuminate the space, but reminds us of a force that has existed for a long time and continues to live at its own pace without needing either confirmation or explanation. Ghost ships of the Korean Sea. When the first fishermen noticed silhouettes moving silently through the morning fog, they thought they were ordinary vessels that had lost their way. But when the fog cleared, they saw that the ships stood motionless, as if abandoned, and their dark sides rose above the water as if they had come from a time that did not belong to the sea where people now live. And when the crew tried to get closer, it became clear that there was not a single movement on the decks. The ship looked as if it had been abandoned suddenly, for there were objects lying on the decks that had not been washed away by the waves, which was strange, because in these waters the strong currents usually leave nothing behind, even if the ship has been drifting for only a few hours, and when the observers went on board, they saw that everything inside was intact, as if the crew had abandoned the ship voluntarily, leaving dishes, blankets, and personal belongings in such order as if they were going to return in a minute. What was particularly striking was that the doors and hatches were closed but not locked, and when they were opened, it felt as if the air inside had been standing for too long, retaining a coldness not typical of the outside conditions, and individual rooms seemed slightly damp, although there were no leaks or open windows, which led the researchers to speculate that some hidden process might be at work inside, maintaining the silence and cold. When they tried to tow the ship, it gave way with difficulty, as if it were clinging to the water, although the current should not have held it, but rather pushed it, and at that moment a second silhouette appeared nearby in the fog, and the fishermen noticed that both ships seemed to be heading in the same direction, although they had no engines. And this coordination looks strange, because drifting ships move differently and never repeat each other so precisely. Some experts suggested that the ships could have been caught in a network of currents that form in rare seasons, but this version did not explain the uniform directions and the fact that the ships appeared only in foggy weather, as if they themselves chose the moment when they could be seen and disappeared as soon as the fog thickened, leaving the feeling that they were again going somewhere where the water becomes impenetrable even for sound. Eyewitness accounts said that sometimes in bad weather a thin shimmer would appear above the decks, as if a faint residual light remained inside the ships, similar to the reflection of a distant flash. And several fishermen saw this, who claimed that the light disappeared as soon as they tried to get closer, as if the object itself did not want to be approached too closely, although the instruments recorded only weak vibrations in the air. The strangeness was further heightened by the fact that the instruments were registering short pulses that resembled signals, although no one could determine their source, as the ships were without power and no equipment could operate without energy. This meant that this weak pulse either came from the depths of the sea or was a residual reflection of some other process, and each time the ship sailed closer, the pulses disappeared. Some argued that the ships might have been part of cargo routes abandoned after severe storms, but this theory was undermined upon examination, as the wood and metal looked too fresh, as if the ships had not been in the water for many months, but had appeared recently, although their condition clearly indicated a much longer period of drifting, and this contradiction became one of the most difficult points in the analysis. More frightening was the story of a fisherman who saw one of the ships standing motionless, and at the moment when the fog began to descend, the hull seemed to fall down without leaving a splash, as if the ship had been sucked into the water itself, creating a hole that immediately closed, and when people tried to examine the bottom later, they found no traces of wreckage or changes in the surface, as if the ship had disappeared as silently as it had appeared. Today, these ships are considered one of the most inexplicable phenomena in the Sea of Korea, because no one can say for sure whether their appearances are due to changing currents, ejections from deep layers, or processes that are not yet visible. And every new observer says the same thing. The ships seem to be part of a space that lives its own internal life and appears only when the sea decides to reveal its secrets to people. Civilization Lupara. When the first archaeological teams ascended the high plains between the rugged peaks, they expected to see only traces of pastoral encampments. But instead they discovered strange platforms paved with stone blocks that were too smooth for local traditions. And these platforms stretched so far that it became clear that a culture had once lived here, about which not a single word had been preserved in the chronicles, as if it had existed far from all known roots. The most astonishing thing was that the blocks lying on the surface were all of the same height, and even after centuries of wind and snow, their edges remained remarkably smooth, as if the stone had resisted destruction, bearing the marks of the hands of craftsmen who knew how to work the material without leaving chips. The deeper the researchers dug, the more traces they found, indicating that the platforms were part of a much larger complex. In several places, strange voids were discovered under the stone platforms, created smoothly and deliberately, as if there were rooms there, but their height was too small to serve as housing, and this led the researchers to think that these spaces could have been technical, used for storage or for special processes that are not associated with ordinary life, since the room does not have traces of fire or household items. Locals have long known about the strange stones, which could not be worked with ordinary tools, and they told stories of how, as children, they heard the stone platforms sing when the wind passed over them, as if hidden within were many thin channels, creating a deep and soft echo that lasted so long that it seemed alive. However, no research has been able to find a structure within that explains this surface behavior. The aligned walls, hidden beneath a layer of earth, attracted particular attention. They were constructed in a uniform style, and each slab fit the next so precisely that even a thin sheet could not be inserted between them. This precision is questionable, as the known cultures of these regions did not possess methods that would allow for such meticulous adjustment of stones without metal tools and lengthy processing. When researchers attempted to determine the age of the structures, they obtained very vague data, since the stone does not preserve traces of organic matter, meaning the assessment was based on indirect evidence. However, some areas indicated that the complex could have been built long before the appearance of the first mountain settlements, which places the Lupata civilization in a special category of peoples who disappeared so quietly, as if their existence had dissolved into the changing eras. One of the most puzzling finds was a stone circle made up of huge blocks that were clearly placed vertically, although their weight would not have allowed this to happen without a complex lifting system. This circle was connected to the platforms by thin corridors leading to lower levels, where there were smooth depressions that looked like support points. And no one knows whether they served as the foundation for wooden structures or were part of an unknown ritual. Some believe that the Lupata may have been a culture that disappeared due to a strong earthquake or climate change, as mountainous areas are prone to sudden shifts. However, this theory does not explain why the stones show almost no signs of destruction, and many elements of the complex look as if they had only recently been cleared of dust. And this freshness of form creates the impression that the craftsmen left the sites quite recently, although the earth claims otherwise. What is particularly questionable is that stones similar to tool fragments were found near some platforms, but their shape is too unusual, since the edges appear to be burnt or smoothed, as if the tool worked at high temperatures. But such methods were not known here, and this leads to the idea that the Lupata civilization may have possessed technologies that have not survived or were not written down, leaving only stone shadows of their knowledge. Today, the Lupata complex remains a place where scientists return again and again, trying to understand who built these sites, why they were created, and why the culture disappeared so completely that not a single legend has preserved its name. And each new layer of earth reveals more questions than answers, as if the civilization itself decided to remain hidden, leaving the world only smooth stones, cold echoes, and a depth in which all explanations are lost. Builders of Palmyra. When researchers first discovered strange stone outcrops jutting out of the soil like fragments of ancient walls on a small island, they thought they were simply natural cracks. However, when they began clearing the surface, it became clear that the stones were arranged too regularly, as if someone had once arranged them into a single outline that repeated the shape of the platform hidden under a layer of soil and the roots of old trees. This site turned out to be only part of a larger complex, and as the archaeologists penetrated deeper into the jungle, they saw several more sections of stonework, so precisely executed that some blocks fit together almost seamlessly, as if the builders had had a tool that allowed them to smooth the surface to a degree difficult to explain without the use of knowledge beyond the capabilities of the local tribes of that era. Particularly striking was the stone circle hidden under dense vines. And this circle consisted of high slabs placed vertically, but not by chance, because each slab was turned at its own angle, creating a figure that changed depending on the position of the sun, and some researchers noticed that at certain moments of light, the shadows fell in such a way that they created a pattern similar to a map, and this idea seemed too bold, but the coincidence was too precise to ignore. When the team decided to explore the inner layers of the complex, they discovered narrow passages leading downwards beneath the slabs. These passages were so smooth that they appeared to have been cut not by a chisel, but by some long tool that passed through the stone, leaving smooth walls without chipping. It was this detail that baffled the researchers, as the known cultures of this region did not possess the skills to create such spaces without great effort. When attempting to dig deeper, it was discovered that beneath the complex there was another level consisting of small rooms laid out with identical blocks, and although the rooms were empty, their arrangement showed that the builders had a clear idea of the structure of the entire structure, and this thoughtfulness spoke of a high level of organization not typical of island settlements, which usually built simpler dwellings. Locals told stories of people who came to the island many generations ago, but left it so suddenly that they left no trace of their way of life. And these stories said that the builders possessed knowledge of stone, which allowed them to move huge slabs without difficulty. But this legend has no confirmation, and yet it unusually accurately reflects the mysteries of the complex, as if it was passed down from generation to generation as a memory of something that people could not explain. One of the slabs had a strange feature. When you stepped on it, the surface beneath your foot vibrated slightly, as if there was a hollow layer hidden inside. However, attempts to reach the possible cavity have not yet yielded results, because the stone is too dense and tools leave scratches on the surface. This indicates an unusual hardness of the material, which is not found in the usual rocks of the island. This also raises questions because it means the stone could have been brought from afar. At the top of the island, a ruined stone staircase was found leading down to the cliff, and this staircase looked as if it had once connected to a platform now destroyed by time. But its steps were too straight, and even those that were at an angle maintained the same depth, as if they had been cut in one continuous movement, and this also did not fit in with the local building traditions, where roughly hewn stones were more often used. When researchers compared the arrangement of all the discovered elements, it turned out that the complex formed a figure repeating the direction of the winds and the horizon line, which makes it look like an observation system. However, nothing confirms that the builders were engaged in the study of nature, since no tools or records were found, only stones standing as if they were part of knowledge that passed away with their creators. Today, the builders of Palmyra remain one of the most mysterious cultures because their presence is felt in every block, in every site. But at the same time, it seems so distant that it seems to belong to another era, whose trace has almost disappeared, leaving only stone lines that continue to preserve the memory of people who passed away so quietly that even the sea could not completely erase their work. Stone pipes of Baigong. When the first explorers reached the foot of the cliffs rising above the desert plain, they saw dark holes on the surface of the stone, located at different angles, and these holes resembled parts of some mechanism that had long since stopped working, but had retained its shape so clearly that it seemed as if its creators had left quite recently, leaving behind part of the structure that went deep into the thickness of the mountain. As they got closer, the researchers noticed that the holes led into long channels that extended deep into the earth at an angle that couldn't be explained by a natural process. While normal erosion creates uneven shapes, here the walls of the channels were remarkably smooth, as if someone had run a long rod through them, leaving a mark of equal width along their entire length. This smoothness is still visible even after many centuries, adding to the mystery's power. When they tried to measure the depth of the pipes, it turned out that some of the channels went many steps into the mountain, while others connected with each other, creating a network that resembled a system that could not be imagined as the result of a random formation, and this network seemed planned, as if it was intended to transport liquid, air, or some substance that had long since disappeared, leaving only smooth traces inside the stone. What was particularly surprising was that some of the pipes had different diameters, and the transition between the wide and narrow sections was smooth, without any abrupt changes, as if someone had used a tool that allowed the stone to be moved without breaking, creating a perfect surface inside. This technique was not found in any other culture in the region because the local tribes worked differently, using crude stone processing methods. When the researchers took samples of the material, they found that some of the pipes were composed of a fossilized substance similar to ancient wood, but others had a structure that looked like layers formed under pressure. This discrepancy led them to wonder. Either nature had acted in an unusual way, creating different deposits in one place, or the pipe network had arisen from a combination of several stages associated with an activity that had long since disappeared. Some researchers have suggested that the pipes may have been the base of ancient roots that fossilized over time, but this theory is undermined when examining the internal structure, as the straight lines and smooth walls look too artificial, and the roots do not create uniform shapes in the stone, and many of the pipes are positioned at angles that do not correspond to the direction of plant growth, making this theory unlikely. It is also important to note that several areas of rock were found near the pipes, resembling areas where structures might have once stood, and some of the rock had been leveled by hand or with complex tools, because the surface appeared smooth and even. Although erosion in these areas usually destroys the surface quickly, here the stone seemed to resist destruction, preserving a unique structure untouched by time. When they tried to trace the line of the pipes, it became clear that they formed a peculiar figure, similar to a network, and if you mentally connect the entrances and exits of the channels, you can see a line repeating the shape, which could have been part of some large mechanism, perhaps associated with the movement of water, because nearby there used to be underground springs that could have fed a similar system, but no traces of water remained inside. Locals said that in ancient times, people heard a long humming sound coming from the rocks, especially at night when the air becomes denser, and some believed that it was due to pipes that could transmit the sound or amplify vibrations. But this legend has no confirmation, although the sound sometimes does occur, as if the wind passes through narrow channels, creating a quiet low tone, like a whisper, that stretches along the entire wall. Some researchers have suggested that the pipes could have been part of a ventilation system created by ancient craftsmen, but this theory raises questions, as no traces of buildings or evidence of complex architecture have been found in the region. However, the very structure of the pipes suggests that they could not have appeared without a clear purpose, since such smooth passages are not created by chance and always indicate activity that cannot be determined from surface traces. Today, the Baigong stone pipes remain one of the region's most enigmatic structures, and no one knows who created them, when, or why. But their shape, depth, and unusual network within the rocks reveal that behind this mystery lies a process that remains undecipherable. Every new visitor says that the pipes seem to continue to cling to the mountain, maintaining a silence that can only be heard when one presses one's palm to the cold surface. Holun Village. When the first reports of the missing village reached the nearest county, no one took them seriously, because the disappearance of small settlements sometimes occurred after strong storms. But when the service representatives reached the place where Holun should have been on the map, they saw only a leveled area covered with dry grass, as if the ground had been combed several times by a heavy wind, and not a single trace of houses, fires, or destruction remained on the surface. What was particularly striking was that the area was surrounded by neat rows of bushes, which usually never form regular lines. And this uniformity looks strange, as if someone had removed the houses and rebuilt the landscape to make it look natural. But upon closer inspection, it became clear that the ground here was too soft, as if there were voids beneath the surface that did not allow the soil to settle completely, creating a feeling of hidden depth. When they began examining the soil, it turned out that under the top layer there was a dense litter, reminiscent of an old leveled surface on which buildings once stood. But this surface was too clean, and even in the corners where the remains of coal and household items usually accumulated, there was nothing, as if someone had carefully cleared the area or moved everything together, leaving only an empty outline that does not provide answers as to where the inhabitants went. There was a story going around among the locals that a few days before the village disappeared, many heard a low sound at night, like a distant hum, which slowly moved through the valley, raising a light fog, and this fog did not move like ordinary haze, but seemed to follow a certain line, skirting the hills and then descending towards Holun, and many thought it was just a trick of the wind, but the disappearance made one think about a possible connection. When experts tried to determine whether people could have left the village voluntarily, it turned out that there were no signs of migration. Neighboring settlements had not seen caravans or groups of people, and even the cattle, which usually leave many traces, had disappeared completely, as if they had left the village overnight, without leaving a single track on the soft soil, which seemed impossible, since such movements always leave marks. One of the researchers noted that along the perimeter of the site there are barely noticeable depressions, similar to traces of supports that could have supported lightweight structures, but the structure of these depressions does not resemble ordinary foundations, as they are located strangely symmetrically, as if there had previously been not a village here, but a set of identical modules that could be disassembled and carried away, leaving the surface almost perfectly flat. The strangeness was heightened by the discovery of small stones lying in uniform groups of 3 or 4, as if they were markers or landmarks used by the inhabitants. But their shape is too smooth, and the edges are softly rounded, and these stones do not resemble local rocks because the color and texture indicate that they may have been brought from afar, which creates the feeling that the disappearance is not due to an ordinary natural force, but to a process that was part of the life of the settlement. When the team tried to examine the lower layers of the soil with instruments, it became clear that there were indeed voids underground, arranged in straight lines that intersect at right angles, as if there was a network of corridors under the village. And these corridors could have served as storage areas, but if they were part of the life of the settlement, why did no one know about them? And why did all traces of the people who might have used them disappear? Some experts tried to suggest that the village could have been affected by a collapse of underground pockets, but this theory quickly fell apart, as the surface had not collapsed. On the contrary, it appeared leveled. Such uniformity contradicts the mechanics of a collapse, as Earth forms chaotic cracks when it falls, whereas here the surface seemed to have been smoothed out, leaving only soft outlines resembling traces not completely hidden by time. Now, the disappearance of Holun is considered one of the most mysterious disappearances because there is no trace of panic, no sign of destruction, no trace of migration, only empty flat land in which lines are hidden that defy logic, and every new researcher says the same thing. It seems that the village did not disappear, but was razed or removed as if it had never existed. And this feeling lingers for a long time, like an echo of an invisible action that is still hidden below the surface. Crystal nests of New Caledonia. When the first groups of explorers climbed to the rocky areas lying between the sea cliffs, they noticed strange formations on the surface of the stone, similar to semicircular bowls, inside which thin crystalline threads glistened, and these threads looked as if someone had woven them by hand, although the bowls themselves had a shape that could not be explained by simple weathering, because each one curved in the same way, creating a smooth and even surface. As the researchers got closer, they saw that the crystals inside the nests glowed with a soft light that did not change with the weather, as if the structure had its own ability to retain light. And if you looked at it from a certain angle, you could see how the fine threads inside were intertwined as if creating a pattern similar to a network. But this network was too neat to be random, as natural structures rarely produce such a geometry. Attempts to touch the crystals revealed that they are strangely warm, although the surrounding stone remains cold, and this creates the impression that the threads are storing energy, or perhaps passing it through themselves, since some areas give off a slight tremor similar to a pulsation, and this sensation becomes stronger if you hold your palm next to it for a few seconds, which raises the question of the nature of this warm internal movement. When the researchers tried shining a strong light on the structure, the beam partially passed through the crystals, but a faint shimmer appeared inside that followed the direction of the strands, as if each strand were reflecting the light, creating miniature waves. This reaction appeared as if the structure were responding to external stimulation while maintaining its shape, although none of the tests showed any changes in the material after exposure. Some scientists suggested that the nests were formed as a result of a process that occurred under the influence of ancient hot springs. But this theory quickly collapsed, since springs do not create smooth semicircular bowls, and the formation of crystals always follows chaotic lines, whereas here each thread lies as if someone was following the direction and maintaining a single rhythm, which is difficult to explain by natural means. The strangest thing was that the nests appeared in areas located at different heights, and they were all the same size, as if someone had distributed them according to a certain pattern, maintaining the same distance between the structures. This uniformity is noticeable even to the eye, because one only has to look at the slope to see an imperceptible order, hidden under a layer of vegetation and rock crust. Locals reported that on moonlit nights, the crystals within the nests reflect light especially brightly, as if the surface begins to glow with a soft blue hue, and this glow is visible even from afar, leading to the idea that the structure interacts with cold light differently than with daylight. This effect is repeated with such precision that many believe the nests are part of an ancient system related to skywatching, although there is no evidence for this. Some researchers have tried to take samples of the crystals, but when trying to separate the threads, the surface is destroyed too easily, turning into a powder that loses all properties. And this means that the structure exists only in an assembled form, as if the threads hold each other in a single form, and any intervention destroys it, which makes the study especially difficult because it is impossible to take a sample while preserving its properties. When examining the deep layers beneath the nests, thin cavities were found, as if there was a slight depression at the base, and in these cavities a weak vibration was sometimes detected, similar to the movement of air or water, but there were no sources of movement there, and this makes one think that the vibration may come from the structure itself, as if the crystals were capturing weak vibrations of the earth and transmitting them in the form of a soft tremor. Some have tried to suggest that the nests were part of an ancient device, perhaps connected to the measurement of natural processes, since the structure is too precise to be random, and its distribution resembles a pattern that once had meaning, but not only the creators, but also the knowledge itself have disappeared, leaving only the stone and crystals that continue to glow in the night. Today, the crystal nests remain one of New Caledonia's most unusual finds, as their shape, light, and vibrations create the impression that there is a hidden logic within that humans cannot yet decipher. Everyone who sees them for the first time says that the space around them feels special, as if the nests continue to interact with the earth, sky, and wind, preserving a secret that has never been revealed to anyone. Red Dome Station. When the first reports of the station's disappearance reached the Central Communications Center, no one believed that a modern installation could vanish so suddenly, as the equipment records any changes, and every base leaves traces of signals even after being shut down. However, when the team reached the location where the Red Dome Station had been located on the map, they saw only a flat plateau covered in stone chips, and not a single structural element lay on the surface, as if the station had been removed from the ground in one piece. As the researchers approached, they noticed that the ground beneath their feet looked strangely smooth, as if something heavy had recently stood on it, but the base itself remained inexplicably flat. This flatness was alarming because when any installation is dismantled, traces of cables, fasteners, or metal parts are left behind. But here, there were not even fragments of paint, which inevitably flakes off in the wind, creating small bright spots visible among the gray stone. Some team members noticed that low bushes grew around the site, arranged almost symmetrically. This symmetry looked so unnatural that it seemed as if the vegetation was trying to cover the trail, but did so too quickly. Such dense rows usually take years to form, but here the bushes looked fresh, as if they had grown in a short period after the station's disappearance, which led the researchers to wonder about unusual processes in the soil. When the experts tried to examine the soil deeper, it turned out that beneath the top layer was hidden a dense crust, similar to compacted soil that usually forms after prolonged pressure. However, the crust was too smooth, without the characteristic cracks and bends that appear over years, and this creates the impression that the surface was formed quickly, as if it was affected by a force evenly distributed over the entire area, and this force disappeared as suddenly as the station itself. The most surprising thing was discovered on the northern side of the plateau, where the instruments recorded a weak residual heat that did not correspond to the air temperature, and this heat was contained in small spots located at the same angle, as if reflecting the outline of the device that had previously stood on the surface. But if this is a trace of heating, then why is the surface around it cold, and why has the thermal trace not disappeared, although enough time has passed for the stone to level out? Local residents said that a week before the disappearance, some fishermen heard a sound in the night, similar to a low, drawn-out echo that slowly passed through the valley, and this echo moved as if something large was changing position. But no one saw light or flashes, meaning the sound could have come from deep within the earth. but no tests revealed any voids, although vibrations in the ground could be felt for a long time in certain places. The strangeness intensified when the researchers found small depressions located a few steps from the center, arranged in a perfect circle, and this circle coincided with the diameter of the station platform. But the depressions were not traces of supports, because their shape was too smooth without the characteristic pressed edges. And this makes one think that the depressions could have appeared not from the weight of the structure, but from some process that took place underground and affected only the thin top layer. When the team tried to model the possible causes of the disappearance, a theory arose about a strong vortex discharge that could have lifted the structure into the air. But this theory collapses upon the first analysis, because no vortex could lift equipment weighing several tons, especially without traces of destruction. And the surface at the site of the station is too smooth for something like this to happen, since such vortices leave chaos from the torn earth. Some experts have suggested an underground shift that could have pulled the station down, but this hypothesis is also short-lived because the soil didn't collapse, but looked as if someone had covered the surface with a flat slab. This artificiality is felt with every step because the soil is elastic and dense as if recently processed, which completely contradicts the natural behavior of the surface. Today, the disappearance of the Red Dome station remains one of the strangest events in the region because the place where it stood looks as if it was removed entirely, without a single element, not a single piece of cable, not a single metal part left. And every researcher standing on a flat surface feels the same. The space seems so empty that it feels as if a force has acted here that leaves no trace, but changes the very structure of the surface. Stonefield of Vicino. When the first explorers reached the foot of the hill, covered in dense forest, they noticed that the ground beneath their feet gradually changed structure as the soft soil suddenly gave way to smooth stone surfaces that looked as if someone had once leveled a huge area of land, creating a semblance of a platform. However, this platform was not flat, but consisted of many stone slabs separated by thin lines, like a network that repeats the same geometry. When the researchers began to examine the field more closely, they saw that each slab was shaped like an irregular polygon, but the division lines were so smooth that it looked as if someone had passed a tool across the surface, cutting the stone effortlessly, leaving deep grooves of equal width, with the depth of the grooves not changing from the center to the edges, which is completely contrary to natural weathering, which usually creates chaos rather than precision. What was particularly striking was that many of the slabs were slightly tilted, and this tilt was repeated across the entire surface so neatly that one might think the field was created according to a pre-planned plan, since each line leads in a specific direction, as if a player in a grand strategy game were plotting a path that a person could only see from above. And this direction coincides with the line of an old riverbed that has long since dried up, which raises new questions. When researchers tried to determine the origin of the stone, it turned out that the slabs were made of a dense rock that is found only at great depths, meaning that the stone had risen to the surface or had been brought from afar. However, neither of these explanations is entirely suitable, as the massif is too smooth, and the arrangement of the slabs too regular to have been formed by normal processes occurring under the influence of weather and time. Some areas of the field were covered with fine furrows that formed circles, and these circles looked as if someone had drawn a sharp tool across the surface, creating perfectly straight lines that were not interrupted at any point, even where the slabs were slightly displaced, which raises the question of how such a shape could have arisen without the presence of a tool that leaves marks of uniform depth and density. When researchers attempted to take temperature measurements, they noticed that the stone in some parts of the field remained warmer at night than usual, as if residual heat were being retained within. However, surface analysis showed no underground sources or flows, leading to the impression that the slabs were able to absorb and retain heat during the day, releasing it slowly at night, as if the field was designed to interact with light and temperature, although there is no evidence for this theory. Locals said that in ancient times, shepherds heard a faint ring of echo from the stone field, which arose when the wind passed through the furrows. This echo repeated the surface pattern, creating the sensation that the stone was responding to the movement of the air. This effect was indeed observed. If you stand at the edge of the field and make a sound, it returns as a thin wave, as if reflecting not from the ground, but from a hidden structure beneath the surface. Several researchers tried to find traces of stone processing, since the evenness of the lines seemed artificial, but no characteristic chips, blows, or tool marks were found. And this makes the field even more mysterious, because natural cracks never produce such geometry, and artificial methods would leave traces that are easy to detect. So the question remains: if the field was created, then who worked on such an area, and with what? The strangeness is heightened by the fact that the stone slabs are arranged in layers, and the lower layers have the same structure as the upper ones, as if the whole mass were repeating the same pattern, continuing in depth, and this repetition is not characteristic of natural processes that create differences between layers, since each period leaves its own trace. But here, everything looks as if the slabs were formed simultaneously by a single action. Today, the Isino stone field remains a mystery that cannot be explained by conventional theories, because every line, every slope, every shape speaks of someone's work, but not a single people who lived in these places had either the tools or the knowledge to create such a structure, and therefore the field stands in silence, as if waiting for someone who can decipher its hidden meaning, left behind by a layer of time and wind. Stone spheres of Bhutan. When the first geologists climbed the remote hills between dense forests and deep valleys, they noticed strange, rounded shapes on the surface of the earth, half hidden under moss and damp soil. And these shapes were so regular that it seemed as if someone had left many identical stone balls there. But the more the explorers cleared the surface, the clearer it became that the spheres of different sizes created a strange pattern that repeated with almost mathematical precision. Each sphere has a surface so smooth that rainfall has not changed it at all over the years. And even areas where moss has completely covered the stone show no signs of destruction, as if the surface has a special density that resists time. And this feeling is intensified when the researcher touches the sphere with the palm of the hand, because the stone seems unusually cold, although the surrounding soil is warm, as if the sphere maintains its own internal rhythm. When the sizes of the spheres began to be measured, it was discovered that they ranged from small objects barely larger than the size of a human head to enormous stone forms that were impossible to move. And the largest ones looked as if they had grown into the ground before the appearance of dense forests, which raises the question of age, since no one knows exactly when they were created and why the surface of the stone holds its shape so smoothly, showing no cracks or signs of decay. Some researchers suggested that the spheres could have formed naturally in ancient volcanic processes. But this theory quickly became shaky, since natural formations rarely produce a perfect spherical shape, especially in such different sizes, and most importantly, in the same texture of the stone, which maintains a homogeneity not found in natural accumulations, where there are always differences between layers and density. When the team attempted to examine the spheres in deeper layers, it turned out that many of them were located partially underground, giving the impression that someone had placed them there in advance, and then the earth had risen and covered part of the surface. However, the spheres themselves were located at the same depth, which is unusual, since in natural conditions, objects of this size would be distributed randomly, and not in a smooth line following the shape of the slope. What was particularly interesting was that some of the spheres formed chains that went up the slopes, as if creating a route, but this route did not coincide with natural paths and did not lead to the top, but stretched towards a stone platform covered with moss, and this platform was a flat surface on which traces of thin lines were visible, as if someone had once drawn pictures or divided the stone into parts, but these lines were too erased to read their meaning. Locals said that the spheres were considered the guardians of ancient knowledge, and ancient legends said that each sphere contained a sound that could be heard if you touched the stone in the silence of the night. Researchers have indeed noticed that some spheres emit a subtle vibration that passes through the palm of the hand with a barely perceptible movement, as if there was a cavity hidden inside, but instruments did not detect any voids, which makes this sensation mysterious and difficult to explain. When they tried to illuminate the spheres with special rays, it turned out that their internal structure was completely uniform, and the stone had no layers, which makes the question of the method of formation even more pressing, since the creation of such smooth forms in such conditions requires an enormous precision which is unknown to any culture that lived in these places, which means that the origin of the spheres remains beyond the scope of conventional historical explanations. Some researchers have hypothesized that the spheres may have been part of a larger complex that was destroyed by time or buried by the Earth, and that the spheres were elements of some kind of system, perhaps related to orientation or information transfer. However, there is no evidence to support this theory, as no other objects have been found nearby other than the mysterious moss-covered platform, which itself raises questions due to the smoothness of its contours and the strange structure of its surface. When the team attempted to map the locations of the spheres, it turned out that many of them were aligned with wind directions, and some were positioned so that their shadows connected at certain times of the year, creating figures that looked like part of a pattern. However, deciphering this pattern has not yet been possible, as too little data has survived from ancient times, and no one knows whether the inhabitants of these places made use of any unusual observations related to the sky or the movement of light. It is also interesting that some spheres sound different when struck, even though they all have the same surface. This difference in sound indicates an internal composition that cannot be seen from the outside, meaning that the structure hides features that cannot yet be studied, and these features may explain why the spheres vibrate or why they maintain a different temperature than the surrounding environment. Today, Bhutan's stone spheres remain one of the region's most extraordinary mysteries, as their shape, arrangement, and internal behavior create the impression that they were created not by chance, but according to some logic, lost with time. Each sphere seems to be part of a story that cannot be read, but can be felt, for a quiet depth always lingers around them, as if the stone holds the memory of events that occurred long before the first humans appeared. Liskure tunnels. When the first explorers decided to follow the old path leading up the wooded slope, they expected to see only the remains of pastures and the occasional rock outcrop. But having climbed a small height, they noticed in the sheer wall a narrow opening that looked too smooth to be a crack, and approaching, they saw the entrance to a tunnel whose walls were so smooth as if they had not been weathered by the wind, but worked by some tool, the marks of which nature could not have repeated by chance. As the explorers walked inside, the air grew colder, and the sound of their footsteps began to echo softly, as if they were dissolving into the depths rather than returning, giving the impression that the walls weren't simply reflecting the sound, but absorbing it, as if there was a structure built inside designed to dampen any vibrations, and this impression intensified with every step, because while normal caves always produce a chaotic echo, here the sound disappeared almost immediately. The strangest thing was that the tunnel did not follow the natural line of the crack, but ran straight, as if someone had chosen a single route and did not deviate from it even a single step. This straightness seemed especially frightening, because such precision is rarely found even in modern workings, and the ancient tribes that lived in these places left no legends or traces of the craftsmanship that could have created such long, straight passages without deviations or blockages. In one section, the walls had thin parallel incisions that ran from floor to ceiling, and each incision was of the same depth, as if a tool had been passed over the stone with constant force. This repetition could not be accidental, since natural processes always create unevenness. But here, every line looked intentional, as if someone had once tried to structure the surface, adding a rhythm to it that was hidden from the ordinary view. As the explorers went further, they discovered a fork, and this was a real shock, because such branches are impossible without a plan, and each tunnel continued with the same precision, without changing width and height, as if the space was created according to a single project that was lost along with those who possessed the knowledge of the correct distribution of stone, the direction of the corridors, and maintaining strength at such a depth. Some areas were covered in a fine coating of dust-like material, but this dust did not settle randomly, but seemed to gather in small bands, as if the air flowed along certain lines, and the researchers noticed that in these areas the air became slightly warmer than in the rest of the tunnel, which raised questions about what exactly was creating this movement and why it repeated itself so precisely, as if the air were following invisible boundaries. When the team tried to go deeper, they discovered stone slabs placed on the floor as if they were part of the floor, but their surface looked smoother than the walls, and if you tried to step on them, you would feel a slight vibration that was transmitted through the sole of the foot with a barely perceptible movement, as if there was a space under the slabs, and this space was not filled with dense stone, but had a structure that was intentionally created. Some researchers have tried to explain the tunnels as the remains of old mining operations, but the problem is that no tool known to the ancient tribes of the region could have created such smooth surfaces, and the depth of the corridors indicates that the task was large-scale, as if those who built it had a purpose that cannot be determined from the remaining traces, since no drawings, writings, or objects confirming the presence of those who built it have been found. Several local legends spoke of how the forests once heard whispering sounds that arose in the dead of night, and that these whispers seemed to echo, not in the air, but within the earth. Some residents believed that beneath the surface there was a network of passages created long ago, but no one knew who could have carried out such work, since there were no hints or legends left in the people's memory about the great construction. When researchers attempted to map the tunnels, it turned out that many of the corridors were not randomly arranged, but formed a pattern that followed the slopes above them, as if the builders had adapted the space to the terrain. This makes the tunnels even more mysterious, as such complexity requires knowledge of rock density and load directions, which are difficult to attribute to cultures that left no technical artifacts. Particularly striking was the section where the tunnel suddenly widened, forming something like a small hall, and the walls of this hall were even smoother than the other surfaces, and the light falling on the stone created the sensation of a barely noticeable reflection, as if the surface was covered with a thin layer of material that reacted to light, but not a single trace of such a coating was found, and the smoothness itself looked too artificial. Today, the less secure tunnels remain one of those mysteries that cannot be explained even approximately, because no one knows who built them, what purpose they served, and why the network of corridors was completely hidden from history, leaving only cold stone, smooth lines, and a sense of space that seemed to have a life of its own until someone disappeared as without a trace as the creators of this strange underground system. Bad civilization. When the first explorers reached the remote slopes where the people calling themselves the Bado live, they expected to find a small settlement following simple rules for survival in a harsh climate. But instead they found a strange picture, because the inhabitants claimed to have never used modern tools and deliberately rejected development, although their behavior, built on strict isolation, seemed too deliberate, as if there was something more behind it than simple tradition. When researchers began to notice the peculiarities of the buildings, they saw that the Bado were using stones that were cut remarkably smoothly, and these stones formed walls that retained heat in the winter and coolness in the summer, as if the craftsmen had knowledge of how to distribute the load and the density of the material, although the Bado themselves denied that they had ever practiced scientific construction, and said that they were simply repeating what their ancestors had taught them, without explaining the origin of these skills. The strangest thing was that many of the stones could not be carried by hand because some of the blocks were too heavy and would require machinery to move them up the slope, which the community never had. And this impossibility creates the feeling that the stones were here a long time ago, long before the current inhabitants settled on the summit, and the Bado themselves admit that some of the stone foundations were already standing when people first came to this area. When the researchers tried to inspect the interior, they noticed strange depressions in the floor that formed a repeating pattern, and this pattern was never explained by the locals, who only said that these depressions had always been there, but no one knew what they were for. And this answer seemed too simple to be true, because the depressions were clearly processed with a tool that left smooth edges, unlike the traces of ordinary handwork. Some members of the expedition noticed that the Bado never showed the explorers the distant hills, and every time the conversation turned to the northern side of the settlement, the inhabitants became silent, as if this area was hiding something they did not want to talk about. And one day an old man let it slip that the north was a place where people disappeared without a trace. But the rest of the villagers abruptly cut off the conversation, not allowing him to continue. When one of the groups attempted to proceed north on their own, they saw an overgrown slope on which stood stone pillars, scattered among the trees so evenly as if they had once formed part of a huge structure. And these pillars were too smooth and high to be erected by people without tools and knowledge. And the Bado, noticing the presence of the explorers in this area, openly asked them to leave, explaining that the land there does not belong to the living. In one of the old buildings, researchers found slabs covered with a pattern of smooth lines, and these lines were so fine that they seemed to have been made with a tool capable of leaving markings more precisely than the stone allows. And if you run your hand over the surface, you get the feeling that the lines vibrate slightly, as if the stone were responding to the touch, although measurements showed no movement or change in temperature. Some have suggested that these slabs might be part of an ancient record, but no one has been able to determine their purpose because the pattern does not resemble a calendar, a map, or a diagram, and it repeats itself so precisely as if it were part of a general structure existing for a task that has long been forgotten. And the fact that the Bado are forbidden to touch the slabs reinforces the impression that they know more than they say, but are trying to hide knowledge that could change the understanding of their past. When the researchers insisted on learning the history of the Bado, the inhabitants replied that their ancestors came to an empty world, even though the slopes were full of objects that could not have been created without advanced technology. This phrase sounded as if people had arrived after another culture had existed here and disappeared for unknown reasons, and the Bado had simply occupied the empty spaces, building their lives around the old heritage. Some archaeologists attempted to excavate, but the Bado forbade digging deeper than a certain level, saying that the stone there is alive. And one night a group of researchers heard a low humming sound coming from the ground, as if there were hollows hidden beneath the surface, and the sound was so even that it created a feeling of movement, although no shocks or vibrations were detected in the soil. A particularly frightening moment occurred when one explorer saw a silhouette on a distant hill, like a tall figure standing between stone pillars. But when he tried to approach, the figure disappeared, as if dissolved in fog. And the Bado, upon learning of what had happened, said only that some shadows are best left undisturbed, after which the conversation finally ceased. Today, the Badu civilization remains a mystery because no one knows whether the Badu are the heirs of an ancient people or merely the accidental guardians of a territory where a culture once existed, possessing knowledge that was lost with its disappearance. And every stone, every slab, every forbidden path reminds us that the answer is hidden, not only in the past, but also in the silence that the Badu maintain to this day, as if protecting a secret that the world is not yet ready to hear. Ancient concrete of Tikal. When the first explorers climbed the steep slopes to the abandoned foundations of the buildings, hidden in the dense tropical forest, they expected to see only more ruins made of stone, which easily erodes time. But when they touched the blocks that made up the bases of the old platforms, it became clear that this material possessed an unusual density. The surface did not crumble or peel, but on the contrary, it seemed as if it resisted even the moisture that could destroy stronger rocks. When experts began to study this material, they saw that its structure was unlike any known method of stone processing. Beneath the top layer, a homogeneous mass was discovered that did not show any signs of layering typical of natural rocks. This mass seemed to have been created artificially, but at the same time, it possessed properties that modern methods cannot yet fully reproduce, as the material appeared too strong and at the same time flexible to be applied. The oddity became more apparent when the researchers attempted to drill small samples for analysis. The tool entered with difficulty, as if encountering elastic density, and the surface around the drilled hole remained smooth, without chips or cracks, an impossibility for ordinary stone, which always suffers at least microscopic damage under pressure. This led the team to wonder if the ancient craftsmen possessed knowledge that has been lost and now seems almost fantastical. When the samples were finally removed, their structure revealed small particles bound together by a substance that resembles modern cement mixtures in properties, but at the same time has strength parameters that are difficult to achieve even today. This fact was striking in that the material was preserved not in one area, but in many fundamental foundations that have withstood not only the pressure of time, but also the effects of moisture, roots, earthquakes, and seasonal changes. What was interesting was that some parts of the ancient concrete had a darker shade, and the inner surface of such samples showed thin channels that could have served either to drain moisture or to strengthen the structure, as is the case with modern reinforced materials, but no traces of metal supports were found, which raises the question, how could the ancient craftsmen have created such a structure if they had no available strengthening methods? When researchers began to explore the deeper levels of the buildings, they discovered entire platforms made entirely of this material, and these platforms were so smooth that it seemed as if the builders had poured the mixture into pre-prepared molds that held the perfect geometry. But if we imagine that the molds actually existed, the question arises of what they were made of, since neither wood nor stone could withstand such a load without collapsing. Some sections of the ancient buildings revealed another peculiarity. When the surface was illuminated at an angle, fine streaks could be seen, as if the mixture had been applied in layers, but each layer appeared so carefully leveled that no transitions were visible, and this level of precision seems unattainable with the tools that would have been available to the ancient builders, given the lack of high-quality metal tools. When local residents heard about these discoveries, they told an old legend according to which the builders splashed a special liquid on the stone, which made it soft like clay. But after a while, it became hard, as if it had never been exposed. Although this legend sounded too fabulous, it still attracted the attention of scientists, because some substances could actually change the structure of minerals, although no evidence has yet been found. Interest and bewilderment increased when traces of geometric notches resembling guidelines were discovered on one of the platforms, and these lines were positioned as if they served as a basis for the precise alignment of blocks. If this was true, then the builders must have had knowledge of weight distribution and how to maintain the stability of structures, since the platform withstood not only the buildings erected on it, but also centuries of earthly movements, remaining intact. When researchers tried to determine the age of the material, they encountered a difficulty because organic inclusions were almost absent, meaning that an exact date could not be determined using traditional methods, and only indirect evidence can be used to judge the concrete, which indicates that it may be much older than the Tikal settlement itself, as if its creators knew methods that were not used by later generations. Of particular interest was an area where the ancient concrete had been cut by a deep groove segment, and this groove ran so smoothly that it appeared to have been created by a tool that left a smooth surface, and some researchers have even suggested that ancient craftsmen might have had a way of heating the material so that it became pliable, and then instantly hardened in the desired shape, but there is no direct evidence. When the team attempted to conduct acoustic measurements on the large platform, they discovered that the surface transmitted sound in an unusual way. Vibrations did not spread randomly as in natural stones, but followed specific lines, as if the material contained an internal system of directions that allowed the vibrations to be distributed evenly, a property that could not be explained by natural processes or known ancient technologies. Some researchers believe that Tikal's concrete was created to support the weight of enormous structures that may have stood here long before the advent of known buildings. If this theory is correct, then the modern ruins are merely later additions, concealing an older layer whose technology remains unparalleled. And it is this layer that holds the answers to questions that will baffle scientists for a long time to come. Today, Tikal's ancient concrete remains one of the most fascinating mysteries because its strength, structure, and properties go beyond the knowledge of ancient civilizations. And each new analysis reveals that this material was created according to principles that are astonishing in their precision, leaving the impression that the builders possessed an understanding of the interactions of minerals, heat, and pressure that the modern world is still trying to unravel. Black Carpet of Bahrain. When the first fishermen noticed a strange dark line in the shallow water, extending so far from the shore that its ends disappeared into the horizon, trembling with heat, they decided that it was a shadow from the clouds. But when the line did not disappear, either with the movement of the sun or with the changes of the tides, it became clear that before them was not an optical effect, but something lying under the water. And explorers who arrived later saw that this path was made of dark, smooth stones, laid so evenly as if someone had pulled them by hand, creating a path not intended for normal traffic. When the experts first descended underwater, they saw that the stones were not lying haphazardly on the bottom, but were stacked in neat rows, with each row following the general curve of the road leading from the shore toward the deep waters, as if the creators wanted to direct traffic to a strictly defined area. This curve is so smooth that it creates the impression of human design, although no known culture in this area built roads underwater, much less had the technology to lay such massive stones in conditions of strong currents. The strangeness is heightened by the fact that the road stones do not resemble the local rocks. They have a density and color rarely found in coastal areas, and their surface is covered with a thin layer of dark film, as if each stone had been worked and then left in the water for centuries, but the surface is not destroyed, but retains a smoothness that looks too artificial to be the result of gradual polishing by the sea. When the researchers decided to trace the beginning of the path, they noticed that the first few dozen steps lead to a small base on the shore, which resembles a foundation, but this foundation is partially hidden by sand, and its shape is too smooth, as if it was a platform from which the movement along the road once began. But neither nearby nor under the ground they found traces of buildings, which creates the feeling that the path was intended not for a settlement, but for another purpose unknown to modern observers. The most astonishing thing was that the path became wider as it went deeper, and its width increased so gradually that it was impossible to tell where exactly this transition began. And this made it look like a structure designed for different levels of traffic, although no one knows what could have moved along this road, given its underwater location and the lack of signs of human use, since no traces of wheels, footprints, or remains of cargo were found there. Some experts have suggested that the path could have been part of an ancient bank, flooded due to changes in sea level, but this version has raised many questions because the stones are too smooth, their placement is too precise, and the width of the path changes too consistently to be explained by natural processes. Since even with a gradual rise in water, coastlines are eroded and never form paths of such length and smoothness. When researchers attempted to excavate a small area, they found a thin layer of light-colored soil beneath a row of stones that appeared to have been leveled before being laid, indicating that the stones had been laid on a prepared foundation, further suggesting that the structure was intentional, as natural processes do not level the ground in this manner. This has led some researchers to believe that the path may have had a directional rather than a locomotion function. This theory is supported by the fact that the path is oriented along a line that coincides with the passage of certain stars during certain periods of the year. And although this connection has not yet been definitively proven, the idea itself is intriguing, since ancient cultures could indeed have used landmarks to determine time or transfer knowledge. And if the path served as a signpost, then its flooding could only be a consequence of climate change, which hid part of the old system. What was particularly strange was that in some places along the path, stones were found with fine parallel cuts that looked as if they had been worked with a tool that left a uniform depth. And these cuts were arranged at an angle that was repeated at certain intervals, giving the impression of a hidden marking system, perhaps intended for those who understood its meaning, but left no written clues. Locals told a story that in ancient times a faint light would rise above this area at night, as if the water were reflecting something beneath the surface, and that this light would move along the path as if following its direction. But modern observations have not recorded such phenomena, although some night divers claim to have seen subtle flickerings similar to the reflection of a distant fire, but with no identifiable source. There are areas within the path where the stones are more densely packed, and the water vibrations in these areas seem stronger, even though the depth is the same. This raises the question, why does the structure react to the movement of the water as if there are voids or channels hidden inside? However, studies have shown only a massive layer of stone containing no internal cavities, and this makes the phenomenon even more mysterious, since it is currently impossible to explain such localized vibrations. When researchers tried to trace the end of the path, they found that it went into a deep area where visibility was reduced, and then the stones disappeared under a layer of silt as if the path had once continued, but was buried by time, and if this was the case, then the path could have been part of a much larger complex hidden under the water, and the entire visible area was only a small part of what was once located in this region. Today, the Black Path of Bahrain remains one of those discoveries that amazes with its scale and unclear purpose. No one knows who created the smooth line extending into the sea, nor why. However, the path's structure, the stability of the stone, and its unusual orientation suggest that it is no accident, but rather the trace of an ancient design that still lurks beneath the water, preserving a sense of mystery that deepens with each new dive. Vaputu stone figures. When the first explorers reached the distant plains that lay between the hills and the dense tropical vegetation, they saw strange shadows on the horizon that resembled pillars, and at first they thought they were simply trees covered with vines, but as they got closer, it became clear that the shadows emanated from tall stone figures standing on small rises, as if someone had distributed them across the landscape with amazing precision. And these figures were so even that they seemed to be part of a single system left by a culture of which almost nothing has survived except these monoliths. Each figure was made of a stone that is not found nearby, as the local rocks are too soft, and these monoliths have a density and color that indicate that the stone could have been brought from afar or mined deep underground. And this raises questions about the methods of movement, because the weight of the monoliths is enormous, and the surface of the stone does not bear traces of rough handling, as if the figures were lifted without the use of levers, leaving no scratches, dents, or cracks. When experts began to study the surface of the monoliths, they noticed fine lines that repeated at different heights, and these lines looked as if they had been applied intentionally, but their depth was so shallow that it seemed as if they had been made by a tool that left an almost imperceptible mark. This subtlety is fascinating because it is difficult to imagine that an ancient people who lived without metal could create such smooth lines on a stone surface that resists any pressure. Some lines run horizontally, while others diverge at a slight angle, forming a complex pattern that is only visible in certain light. And when looking at the figures at sunset, the pattern comes together to form a general design similar to a network, as if each figure is part of a map stretched across the ground and perhaps once served as a landmark, pointing to important points. But all these assumptions remain only guesses because no writing or explanation has been found. What is interesting is that the figures are arranged as if there were a regular distance between them, and if you measure the intervals, you can see a repeating sequence that seems too neat to be random, since nature never creates such an order in uniform areas, meaning that the arrangement of the figures was thought out in advance, perhaps in accordance with the movement of the sun or the winds, although direct evidence has not yet been found. When researchers tried to understand the purpose of the figures, they noticed that some of the monoliths were slightly tilted, but all the tilts were in the same direction, as if the monoliths were responding to an invisible force that was slowly moving them from their original position. However, the bases of the figures were surprisingly stable, and this combination of precision and strength creates the feeling that the materials and knowledge of the builders went beyond the usual understanding of the ancient tribes that lived on the island. Locals tell a story that the figures were once part of a larger ceremony, and that each one stood in its place to hold the breath of the earth. But all the stories are too vague, and no one can say exactly what this breath meant, or why the figures have maintained their position for so long, as if they were actually interacting with the earth, keeping something in balance that remains incomprehensible to modern man. When researchers looked beneath the base of some of the monoliths, they saw that the stone was embedded several steps into the ground, as if the figures were not simply placed on the surface, but driven deep to maintain stability. This raises a new question. How were ancient builders able to dig such deep holes without tools, and how did they move the heavy monoliths to stand them upright? Even in modern times, such tasks require many people and complex equipment. Some monoliths have slightly offset tops, and this offset is reminiscent of celestial landmarks because the figures located on the eastern line repeat the direction of sunrise on certain days, and the figures on the western side stretch to the points where the sun sets at rare times of the year. And if we imagine that the monoliths were part of a solar system of ordering time, then we can assume that the ancient inhabitants had extraordinary knowledge of the position of celestial bodies. When researchers tried to measure the vibrations that travel through the bases of the monoliths during strong winds, they discovered that each figure creates its own sound, barely audible but present in the low-frequency range, and this sound becomes stronger on certain nights, as if the figures interact not only with the wind, but also with changes in temperature, transmitting vibrations to the ground, an effect that could not be explained by conventional methods. Some experts have suggested that the figures may be part of an ancient sound system that used wind and stone to transmit vibrations, perhaps to create signals or warnings. But this remains a hypothesis, as nothing similar has been found anywhere else, and the figures themselves are too massive to be considered ordinary musical objects, although their vibrations under certain conditions do create long, drawn-out sounds. It is also interesting that beneath some of the monoliths are small slabs that replicate the shape of the base, as if the figures stood on an additional support that ensured an even distribution of weight. This technical sophistication is surprising. As such, supports are rarely found in ancient structures, especially in regions where people used simple construction methods that lacked high precision. When researchers tried to determine the age of the figures, they obtained such varied results that it became clear that it was impossible to determine the exact time period because the material does not contain organic matter, and erosion has hardly affected the surface, which creates the impression that the figures are either very ancient or are made of a special stone that does not deteriorate as much as ordinary rocks. And this stone is indeed rare on the island, which raises the question of its origin. Some researchers have attempted to correlate the arrangement of the figures with the lines of electromagnetic activity of the Earth, but the results only added to the mystery, because the figures actually stretch along weak energy zones, as if the builders knew about them and intentionally placed the monoliths in places where the Earth has a special vibration. If this is indeed the case, then a new theory arises. The figures could have served as a tool for maintaining balance in the system that the ancients considered important for maintaining order in the surrounding world. Today, the Waputu stone figures remain one of the region's strangest and most beautiful mysteries, for no known culture has left traces of the technology capable of creating such monoliths, moving them over long distances or installing them in strict accordance with natural cycles. Each figure stands in silence, as if watching over the earth, preserving the memory of those who once created this system, but have disappeared, leaving only the stone, patterns of light, and the slow breath of wind passing between the ancient forms. The lost island of Riemann, When the first satellite images showed that a small island, which had served as a landmark for fishermen for decades, had disappeared from the archipelago, located at the eastern edge of a warm, calm sea. No one believed that the territory marked on maps could simply disappear, since such changes take centuries. However, images taken a few weeks later showed the same empty expanse where Riemann had once been, an island surrounded by shallow reefs and small sand spits that also disappeared as suddenly as if the water itself had swallowed them up. When the first expedition headed to the area of the supposed location of the island, the researchers saw that the water above this place was unusually dark, as if the depth here had sharply increased, although previously the shallow water extended far from the shores of neighboring islands. This sharp difference between the old picture and the current state caused alarm, because such changes could only occur after powerful underground tremors. But no earthly movements were recorded, and this became the first mystery associated with the disappearance of Riemann. When the expedition lowered its instruments, it turned out that the seabed beneath the vanished island had a strange structure. Instead of the expected sandy deposits, the instruments detected a dense rock mass, but the surface of this mass was smooth, as if someone had smoothed it in one large movement. If you ran your hand over it, you got the feeling that the stone had been worked rather than destroyed, as it lacked sharp edges, cracks, or signs of collapse, which are usually left behind by subsidence. Some researchers suggested that the island might have fallen into an underground void, but this theory was disproved by analysis of the deep layers, as the stone slab had no characteristic lines indicating subsidence. On the contrary, it looked as if someone had lowered it evenly, without displacement. Such movement cannot be explained by ordinary geological processes, because the Earth always produces jagged edges, not smooth contours that disappear like a ruler. When divers attempted to explore the lower levels, they saw that the rock surface had thin parallel grooves that ran at an angle, and these grooves were repeated at equal distances from each other, giving the impression that the rock had been worked rather than destroyed, and some lines stretched for tens of steps, disappearing into the depths, which raises the question of what exactly formed this network, since natural erosion does not create such even and long grooves. What was also strange was that the water above the area seemed denser, and the instruments recorded small fluctuations in density that alternated with the same frequency, as if there was movement under the water not related to the current, but similar to the vibration of the surface. And this vibration could sometimes be felt even on the hull of the boat, as if something was slowly working or moving under the slab, although no noise or thermal traces were detected. Local fishermen told stories of a strange fog rising over Riemann several days before the island's disappearance. It lay thick and moved not with the wind, but along the coastline, as if following an invisible route. This fog had a whitish hue, which is rare in a warm sea, where humidity creates darker and heavier vapors. This deviation from the norm was considered by many to be merely a strange phenomenon until the island finally disappeared. Some residents claim to have heard a low tremor, like a distant blow, the night before the disappearance, but the sound was too even, not like the usual sounds of the sea, and the tremor lasted for several seconds, after which it disappeared, leaving an uneasy silence. And this event in people's memories is associated with the fact that Riemann disappeared immediately after a strange sonic shock, but no instrument recorded the Earth's movement. When divers explored deeper levels, they discovered that the stone slab that replaced the island had lower projections that resembled supports spaced at equal distances. And these projections looked as if they were holding the slab up before it sank. But such a mechanism does not exist in nature because water and stone interact differently, and no natural process would create uniform supports beneath the slab, as if the structure had a technical basis. Some researchers have suggested that the island may have been part of an ancient platform, located above the seabed and supported by a structure hidden underwater. But this theory raises more questions than it answers, because if the platform really existed, it must have been created by hands that had knowledge of stone alignment and weight distribution, and no traces of a similar civilization capable of working with massifs of such density and size have been found in the region. What is also strange is that around the vanished area, the water has a different color, as if a weak current passes over the slab, different from the surrounding layers. And when instruments analyze this area, they show small deviations in temperature, although these changes are so small that they cannot indicate underwater sources, but noticeable enough to consider them part of a hidden process occurring under the slab. When researchers tried to trace the outline of the vanished island using old data, they saw that Riemann's shape matched the curve of the underwater plate, as if the island were following the line of what lay deeper. And this precision suggests that the island itself could have been part of a structure that remained on the surface for centuries until it disappeared, as if on command. But this idea is too bold to be accepted as the official version. Several researchers have also noticed that at night the water reflects the light of the stars in an unusually smooth manner, as if the surface above the slab were perfect, as if polished, and this sensation is noticeable even in low light, creating the impression that the slab has properties that are difficult to explain by ordinary natural factors. And this smoothness is accompanied by a quiet trembling that is heard only by those who spend a lot of time on the water. Today, the lost island of Riemann remains one of the strangest mysteries of the region, because no natural process can fully explain its disappearance, and every detail, the smooth slab, the fine furrows, the dense water, the faint vibrations, comes together to form a picture that seems to be part of a system hidden beneath the sea. A system that remains invisible but is felt by everyone who approaches the place where the island stood, as if the memory of it had dissolved not in the water, but in that mysterious mechanism that is hidden beneath the thickness of the depths. Nimrud lenses. When the first researchers studying the ruins of an ancient complex found near the ancient hills first saw a small, transparent oval lying among the rubble, they thought it was simply a piece of quartz that had accidentally ended up in the fabric of the earth. However, when one of the archaeologists held the object up to the light, it became clear that the surface had a smoothness that could not be explained by a natural fracture, because the oval refracted the rays as if it had been processed with fine movements comparable to grinding. When the lens was examined more closely, it was discovered that its thickness gradually changed from the center to the edge, and this gradual change was so precise that it seemed as if the creators had an understanding of how light passes through the material, because the lens magnified the image, although the image quality was slightly distorted. But the fact of magnification itself was surprising, because such knowledge requires a deep understanding of reflections, refractions, and angles, which the ancient tribes did not formally study. The strangeness became even more pronounced when several more oval objects were found nearby, each with its own curvature. These lenses varied in thickness, transparency, and shape, as if their creators were experimenting with creating the perfect transparent structure. This raises the question, why would a tribe that lived long before the advent of known optics need such objects? And why were they hidden in one of the most closed rooms of the complex? Some researchers have suggested that the lenses could have been used to improve vision, and this idea seems logical since the magnifying properties are obvious, but the fact that several lenses are shaped in a way that is not convenient for placing them on the eye suggests that they could have been part of a system related to observing the sky or were used for processing small details, perhaps when creating the complex patterns found on the walls of the complex. But there is no direct evidence for this version yet. When researchers examined the lens material, they discovered that it was a transparent stone that had been heated and gradually worked, and the temperature required to soften such a structure must have been very high, which raises the question of how ancient craftsmen could have achieved such temperatures if no furnaces or tools capable of withstanding such conditions have been found in the region, a fact that makes the lenses even more mysterious. One lens found under the earth attracted particular attention because it had an unusual semicircular protrusion on one side, and this protrusion was too smooth to be a coincidence, as it could have served as part of a mechanism that allowed the lens to be held in a certain position, and if so, The lens could have been part of a device that was used in a complex, perhaps for observing small objects or light sources. When the researchers tried to shine a beam of sunlight through the lens, the surface produced an unusual reflection, creating narrow lines of light that formed a shape resembling an irregular square. This shape changed depending on the angle at which the beam passed through the material. This effect cannot be achieved by chance, as lenses must be shaped in advance to form a pattern that can be used for observation or calculation. Some researchers have noticed that near the lenses there were stone slabs with thin lines that formed a grid similar to a diagram, but the lines intersected at angles that coincided with the angles of reflections created by the lenses. And this allowed them to put forward the theory that the slabs could be used as a surface for light observations and the lenses served as instruments for correcting the rays. But this theory requires further evidence. A stone bowl was discovered in one of the rooms, the inside of which was polished to a mirror shine. This raised new questions, as the bowl could have served as a reflector, helping to concentrate light. If lenses were used with such bowls, it can be assumed that the ancient masters were creating a complex in which light played a key role, perhaps for rituals associated with the sky, or to study the structure of the stone that formed the walls of the complex. Local legends told the story of how craftsmen could once make day out of night using light collected in stone, and while this sounds like a myth, the idea that the ancients could manipulate light in more complex ways than is commonly believed is not impossible, as lenses confirm a knowledge of refraction, and smooth reflective surfaces indicate a familiarity with the basics of optics, even if that knowledge was intuitive rather than scientific. When researchers looked for evidence of tools that could have been used to work such hard rock, they found only a few stone fragments that could have been used as grinding materials. But none of these explain the precision seen on the lens's surfaces, as their creation requires tools capable of working on the finest edges, and this precision challenges the idea that ancient craftsmen worked without sophisticated tools. Some experts have suggested that lenses could have been used not for observation, but for focusing fire, creating pinpoint heating. This idea has some basis, since lenses allow one to concentrate light, creating powerful heat. If the ancients knew about this property, they could have used lenses in rituals associated with fire or for processing materials. However, the lack of traces of such processes makes this version just one of many. The most astonishing thing happened when the researchers directed a weak beam through the largest lens and noticed that the light passing through it was divided into thin lines that formed a pattern that coincided with the lines on one of the stone slabs. This coincidence is difficult to consider a coincidence because the structure of the slabs resembles a map that can only be read with a lens. And if this is so, then the lenses could serve as a key that allows one to decipher hidden messages left by ancient masters. Today, the Nimrud lenses remain one of the region's most eerily precise mysteries, for their shape, structure, and ability to interact with light-reveal knowledge that defies common understandings of ancient civilizations. Each lens appears to have been created for a purpose, lost along with the culture, buried beneath layers of earth. This lost meaning still lives on in the transparency of the stone through which light passed, creating patterns incomprehensible to modern man. The Cave Symphony of Meknes. When the first explorers descended into the old cave systems located on the outskirts of the ancient settlement, they expected to see the usual ledges, damp walls, and dark passages characteristic of mountain cracks carved by time. However, instead of the chaotic sounds that usually arise in such places, they heard a strange, even echo that arose with every step. This echo did not run along the corridors, but seemed to repeat at the same length, creating the feeling that there was an invisible system inside the cave that made the sounds live their own life. As they moved further, they noticed that each corridor had its own sound, unlike the next, and if they clapped their hands or knocked on a stone, the echo returned with an unexpected frequency, as if the space was constructed in such a way that the sound changed with each step, and this oddity gave the feeling that the cave reacted to the presence of a person, changing the sound depending on the depth and direction of movement. Some areas had such a strong resonance that it seemed as if there were hidden voids in the walls, but equipment lowered into the depths revealed dense stone which should not have amplified the sound, but it not only amplified it, but also transformed it, creating new vibrations similar to a low hum. And this hum sometimes repeated itself in the same places, as if the cave remembered the sound and played it back later. And this feature raised many questions about the nature of this effect. When the researchers reached the central hall, they saw that the walls did not resemble ordinary natural stone, because the surface had unusual semicircular depressions located at equal distances. And these depressions create the impression that someone had once worked the wall with a tool that left an even, rounded mark. Such precision is not typical of natural processes, because erosion acts chaotically, and here the order is too obvious. Each cavity had its own acoustics, and if you struck its edge with a stone or simply broke the silence, the sound would spread from the surface and turn into a long, low tone, like the soft echo of an old instrument. And these tones varied from each other, as if each niche had its own frequency. And this harmony of sounds creates the impression that the cave is not just a natural structure, but a carefully constructed room, built according to principles that now seem lost. When researchers tried to reproduce the sounds in different parts of the cave, they noticed that some corridors captured the tone as if there was an invisible string inside, and the vibration was transmitted through the stone, repeating the sound over a distance. This amazing quality cannot be explained without knowledge of how sound propagates in dense surfaces, since such precision is observed only in carefully designed spaces and not in natural systems. What was interesting was that in the deepest part of the cave, there was a chamber in which the sounds became completely different. Instead of the usual echo, the researchers heard a soft, drawn-out hum that passed through the walls, as if a huge surface was hidden underground, resonating with the cave. This effect was felt in the chest, like a weak wave that slowly passes through the body, leaving a feeling that something was moving underground, although the instruments did not record any physical movement. When researchers attempted to record detailed sound recordings, they found that many of the sound waves had repeating patterns, as if the cave created its own rhythm based on frequencies independent of human control. And this rhythm repeated throughout the day, changing only during the night hours. This led the researchers to believe that the cave may interact with air temperature, creating sound variations that affect the acoustic structure. Some areas of the cave had such a strong acoustic response that sound bounced off the wall so quickly, as if the space were being compressed, and researchers said that these areas were similar to ancient instruments used to create sound-based rituals, because the sound in these areas does not simply reflect, but creates the sensation of an invisible cavity in the wall that amplifies low frequencies. Locals said that in ancient times, the cave was considered a place where the earth speaks, and that the inhabitants of the ancient settlement used the cave to perform ceremonies that depended on sound, because only on certain nights could special vibrations, similar to a song, be heard, but no one could explain what exactly created these sounds, because there is no water or wind in the cave that can penetrate so deeply. When researchers attempted to compare it with other caves in the region, they realized that none of them had such a smooth structure or could reproduce sounds with such precision. While most natural systems create a multi-voice echo, here the sound does not break apart, but seems to dissolve in space, turning into a drawn-out tone that retains its shape, as if there were a complex network of invisible channels inside. What was particularly frightening was the moment when the team recorded a sound that none of their actions could reproduce, because the recording captured a deep, drawn-out voice that no one heard at the time of recording. And this sound was similar to the movement of a stone, but too smooth, too rhythmic to be random. And the researchers discussed the origin of this sound for a long time, but were never able to determine what exactly created this sound wave. Some have suggested that the cave may have been part of an ancient complex based on sound resonances, and that the recesses in the walls and smooth corridors were created intentionally to amplify or transmit sound waves, perhaps for ritual purposes. As sound can evoke special sensations in humans, and ancient cultures could use this to create spaces that affect consciousness through low vibrations. Today, the Cave Symphony of Meknes remains one of the most enigmatic acoustic structures of the ancient world because the combination of smooth depressions, parallel corridors, resonant chambers, and repeating sound patterns creates the feeling that the cave was built according to principles that go beyond ordinary architectural experience, and each of its parts seems like an instrument that has preserved the voice of time, continuing to resound in the darkness of the underground chambers. The sunken hill of Vinh Mon. When the first fishermen noticed that not far from their usual route, the boat suddenly began to slow down, as if encountering an invisible obstacle, they thought that a reef was hidden under the water, which had never been seen in this place before. However, when they lowered a pole to check the depth, it became clear that beneath the surface there was not a sharp rock, but a wide, flat massif that rose almost to the water itself, as if the top of a long-forgotten hill, the existence of which was not noted on any old map, was hidden under the sea. When the researchers arrived at the site, they noticed that the water above it had an unusually light hue, as if reflecting not a sandy bottom, but a smooth rock surface. When the first divers descended, they discovered not a chaotic landscape, but a smooth, sloping surface covered with a thin layer of algae that could be easily removed by hand, revealing a smooth material resembling a processed surface. This smoothness was surprising, as natural geological formations rarely create such neat, sloping surfaces. When the divers began to examine the surface, they noticed thin, parallel grooves that stretched almost across the entire width of the sloping massif. And these grooves ran at the same angle, as if someone had once drawn a tool across the stone, leaving even lines, and this repeatability seemed too precise to be a random occurrence, because the current and time leave chaos, and here, order was visible, as if the surface were part of a structure designed for ascent or descent. When the researchers dug deeper along the slope, it turned out that the plane led to an expanded platform located under a significant thickness of water. And this platform looked as if it had once served as a base for something that stood on top of it, because its edges have projections reminiscent of the bases for attaching posts or columns. And such elements are not found in natural landslides, because nature does not create projections of the same shape and the same distance from each other. Particularly surprising was the fact that the surface of the stone had an unusual density. Striking it produced a deep, dull sound, as if there was a cavity beneath the layer, but when instruments checked the lower levels, it turned out that the stone was a smooth mass without voids, and this raises the question of why the sound reacts as if another level or structure is hidden inside. Although visually the stone appears monolithic, and this oddity remains unexplained. When divers began to examine the edges of the site, they saw that part of the massif ended smoothly, as if someone had cut a piece of the surface with a straight line, and this line was so neat that it could be mistaken for a cut mark, but no natural process could create such a smooth edge underwater, especially in an area where the current constantly changes the relief. And this fact strengthens the suspicion that the massif is of artificial origin, or at the very least, was processed by the hands of unknown builders. Locals told an old legend that on the site of the sunken hill there once stood a structure that could rise and fall with the water. And although the legend sounded like a fairy tale, the very existence of a smooth, sloping surface leading to a level platform led many to wonder. Perhaps the structure really could change its height, using mechanisms hidden beneath the stone. But no evidence has yet been found to support this idea. Some researchers have suggested that the sunken mound could have been part of an older complex that sank underwater due to changing sea levels. But this theory is questionable because the surface is too well preserved and the structure of the furrows appears fresh, as if it fell underwater not thousands of years ago, but much later. although no evidence of such events has survived, and the sea level in this region did not change so dramatically as to hide the entire structure. When researchers attempted to trace the boundaries of the hill, they saw that the massif descended deeper, forming steps, each of which had the same height and width, as if the creators wanted the downward movement to occur gradually. Such steps do not resemble natural formations because nature is characterized by chaotic cliffs and sharp changes. But here, the height of each level seemed to have been measured in advance with amazing precision. Of particular interest were the small round depressions located along one of the steps, and these depressions are repeated at equal intervals, as if they served as places for installing something that could hold the structure or serve as part of a mechanism. And if we imagine that the sunken hill was part of a complex structure, then these holes could have been supports for wooden or stone elements, long since destroyed by time. Finally, the deepest part of the massif turned out to be especially mysterious. The surface of the hill drops off abruptly, revealing a narrow corridor leading even deeper, and the walls of this corridor have an unusual shape. They are slightly curved inward, creating the sensation that the passage is narrowing, although in reality the space remains the same, and this effect of optical compression causes a slight feeling of anxiety, as if the corridor is moving as you approach, although this is just a play of light and shape. As divers explored the corridor, they noticed that there were subtle patterns on the walls, made up of many small dots, and these dots formed lines running at different angles, forming a complex design that was impossible to see in its entirety without strong lighting. And even then, the design remained unclear, as if the technique used to create it was too complex to remain clear underwater. Some researchers believe that the sunken hill of Vinh Mon may be part of an ancient structure that stood above sea level for a long time and was used for ritual or astronomical purposes, and was then absorbed by water due to processes that cannot yet be explained because no factor indicates a sharp rise in water or sudden subsidence. But the hill itself retains too many artificial characteristics to be considered a natural formation. Today, the sunken hill of Vinh Mon remains one of the strangest finds in the region because the combination of flat surfaces, furrows, steps, circular depressions, and a deep corridor creates the impression that a piece of ancient architecture belonging to a civilization that disappeared without leaving a trace on the surface is hidden under the water. The water above the hill seems too calm, as if it itself conceals the memory of what once rose above the sea and now lies in the silent depths, preserving a secret that is difficult to explain even with the boldest hypotheses. Liuhe Power Station. When the first specialists began to study the abandoned concrete foundations scattered along the dry bed of an old river, they assumed that they were the remains of ordinary industrial facilities built in the last century. However, after the first measurements, it became clear that the sites were too old to belong to recent systems, and their age did not match any recorded construction phase in the region, and the shape of the foundations turned out to be so unusual that it seemed as if these platforms were created for purposes incomprehensible to modern engineers. When researchers looked closely at the surface of the concrete slabs, they saw thin lines running in a straight line, and these lines stretched for dozens of steps without changing thickness or direction, as if someone had been working with a tool capable of cutting stone with a precision that was beyond the usual capabilities of ancient builders. This strange combination of smoothness and age made many wonder who exactly could have possessed such technology in an era when civilizations barely knew how to build strong walls. The strangest thing was that the concrete was not ordinary, for its structure resembled a mixture created by a principle not used in the known history of construction, and the material extracted from the samples had a density that could only be achieved using methods similar to modern technology. But the age of the slabs indicated that they were created long before such processes became possible, meaning that either the platform was rebuilt later or the ancients possessed knowledge that has been lost. When researchers attempted to study the shape of the sites, they noticed that many of them formed even rows, and if these rows were connected with lines, they formed a complex network resembling a diagram, But this diagram did not match any known power supply system, although the arrangement of the sites resembled the arrangement of points through which the power distributed throughout the site could pass. And this similarity gave reason to assume that the layout was connected to the energy flows of the Earth. Some platforms had deep depressions, cut with such precision that their shape was preserved almost perfectly, despite the destruction of the edges and the effects of time. And these depressions looked like places for the installation of large structures, perhaps columns or vertical devices. But no traces of fastenings or remains of metal parts were found, and this surface clarity was striking, as if the elements stood on the platform independently, without fixation. The most surprising thing was that next to some of the slabs there were small stone blocks located in groups, and if you hit them, the sound was given off by a dull resonance that did not correspond to their size, and this resonance created the feeling of a hidden cavity, but studies showed that the blocks were monolithic, and this acoustic feature gave rise to the version that the blocks could be part of a system that works with sound or vibration, and such properties could be used to transmit energy or signals. When researchers examined the far reaches of the complex, they saw that some of the slabs were aligned with the sun's position on certain days of the year, suggesting that the builders were using solar cycles to initiate or regulate the system. However, if this is true, it raises the question of how exactly energy could have been transferred through the stone platforms. As concrete is not a conventional conductor, although certain types of minerals can interact with heat and light in unusual ways. More questions arose when one researcher noticed that underneath one of the bases, the surface of the stone had a mesh-like structure, and this structure consisted of intersecting lines that looked as if they were created intentionally rather than left by nature. And if this was indeed the case, then this mesh could have served as part of a complex mechanism. But it was impossible to explain how it worked because no parts of the mechanical systems were preserved. Locals told a legend that in ancient times these platforms came alive at night with a faint light rising above them, like a distant glow. While this sounds like fiction, some researchers have noticed that the surface of the slabs unusually reflects the moonlight, creating subtle highlights that move along the lines as if following invisible routes. This effect is only observed at certain angles of light, making it even more mysterious. When researchers attempted to trace the relationship between the platforms, it turned out that they were not randomly placed, but formed a huge grid, including dozens of points connected by geometrically precise lines. This grid repeated a pattern similar to a force distribution diagram. Although no one can say what exactly was distributed through these points, the very precision of the arrangement suggests that the builders had a deep knowledge of the interaction of landscape elements. Some researchers have suggested that the Laohe complex may have been part of an ancient system that harnessed solar, earth, or vibrational energy for purposes now unknown, and that the concrete platforms may have served as foundations for devices long since eroded by time. But that leaves the question of why the material has withstood thousands of years with little or no degradation, given that its density and composition appear far too modern. One platform was of particular interest. Its surface had strange marks, similar to long scratches, but these scratches were not randomly located, but repeated in a pattern resembling circles, and each circle had an equal distance from the next, as if the marks were created by a rotating element that was located in the center of the platform. This version seems too fantastic, but the patterns coincide with the trajectories that are left by devices with constant rotation. When the researchers attempted to analyze the composition of the material, they discovered tiny inclusions that were not immediately identifiable, and these inclusions responded to temperature changes with subtle color changes, as if the material could use heat to convey information about the state of the structure. This seems unlikely for ancient structures, but samples show that the inclusions are present in every slab, suggesting they were intentionally added. Today, the Laohe power plants remain one of those mysteries that spark debate among researchers because the concrete platforms, lines, grids, depressions, and acoustic properties point to a complex system created long before the advent of technology capable of explaining its existence, and each slab holds traces of knowledge that may be part of a lost civilization that left behind a mechanism that once worked but now lies in silence, hiding a meaning that remains inaccessible. Hopu people of Tanzania. When the first explorers traveling through plains covered with dry grass and sparse trees heard from local guides mention of a people who supposedly lived separately from everyone else, not accepting strangers and not showing their villages, they decided that they were talking about one of the many tribes leading a solitary way of life. However, after the first observations, it became clear that the Hopu people did not fit into any known classification of local cultures because their traces were found not in the places where tribes usually live, but in areas where it would seem impossible to establish a permanent settlement. When researchers began to gather scraps of information, it became clear that the Hopu had always built their dwellings not on the surface, but in natural depressions, which no one had yet been able to locate with certainty. Because people who had accidentally seen representatives of the Hopu said that the disappearance of tribe members happened so quickly, as if they had fallen into the ground, although no one had found any visible entrances, and this ability to disappear became a key part of the legends that surrounded the tribe. The strangeness intensified after the shepherds told the researchers that on some nights they had heard a soft humming sound that seemed to come from underground. And this humming sound was so even that it resembled a pulsation spreading through the soil. And the shepherds assured that such sounds always meant that the Hopu were nearby, although no one saw them on those nights, and this created the impression that the tribe possessed the knowledge that allowed them to create vibrations underground. When the researchers tried to follow the tracks left in the dry soil after the rain, they noticed an unusual feature. The tracks ran in a straight line without changing direction, as if those who left them moved with amazing precision and a uniform rhythm. This straightness is almost impossible in the conditions of rugged terrain, where trails constantly wind, but Hopu's tracks seem to cut through the plain, heading towards the hills that no one had previously associated with human presence. As the explorers approached the hills, they saw that the ground surface had unusual indentations arranged in a wide circle, and these indentations did not look like animal tracks or natural faults because they had smooth edges, as if they had once served as supports for wooden structures. But if the Hopu really built shelters on the surface, then why had no one seen the buildings themselves, and why did the tracks not lead inside the circle, but seem to go around it? When one of the research groups decided to conduct a detailed examination of the hills, they noticed that under the layer of dry grass there were thin cracks running in one direction, and these cracks looked as if the ground was slowly rising and falling in one place, as if there was a large underground cavity underneath it, and this led to the assumption that the Hopu used a system of underground corridors that went deep into the hills. When researchers tried to widen one crack to get inside, they saw that the crack led to a narrow passage covered with a smooth surface, and this surface was different from the surrounding earth because it was dense and elastic, as if made of compressed material, but no traces of processing with tools were found, and this surface could not have formed naturally, which raised even more questions about who created it and how. When one of the researchers lowered a device for measuring sound vibrations into the passage, it turned out that there was a weak vibration inside the corridor, similar to the one described by the shepherds, and the vibration intensified when a person moved, as if the space were reacting to the presence. This sensation was so strong that many expedition members said that the corridor seemed to be alive because the vibrations came in waves, moving in different directions. Some researchers have suggested that the Hopu may have created underground living spaces using soil compaction techniques or materials found in the surrounding environment. But this theory doesn't explain the smoothness of the walls and the lack of signs of processing. Even the most skilled craftsmen leave traces of their work, especially on compacted soil. However, here the surface was so smooth, it seemed as if someone had used technology to shape the structure of the earth from within. Locals said that in ancient times, the Hopu knew how to walk underground, and that they never built houses on the surface because the earth was not just a support for them, but a living being that protected them, and that they knew how to listen to its vibrations, distinguishing changes in the soil. However, no one took these stories seriously until researchers discovered a network of cracks and passages indicating the existence of an underground system. When the expedition tried to penetrate deeper into one of these corridors, they saw that the space widened, forming a small chamber, and the walls of this chamber were in the shape of an arch, but the arch was so smooth that it was difficult to mistake it for a natural one, and this created the impression that the space was created intentionally, perhaps for storing objects or performing rituals, but no artifacts were found there. What was especially surprising was that the air in the chamber was surprisingly fresh, as if there was a ventilation system inside that allowed the air to circulate, and if the corridor was old, the air should have been musty. But here it was light and cold, as if the space was still in use, and this fact gave rise to the theory that the Hopu still live underground, avoiding contact with the outside world. When the explorers returned to the locals to share their findings, they received a short reply. "If the earth has allowed you to pass, it means it considers you guests." And this phrase sounded as if the people believed that the underground passages did not belong to them, but to the earth itself, which decides who can enter and who must remain outside. And this belief only increased the mystique of the tribe. Today, the Hopu people remain one of Tanzania's most hidden and enigmatic cultures because their existence is felt, but the evidence of their life seems to be dissolved underground, and a network of smooth corridors, dense vibrations, and strange arched chambers creates the sense that the Hopu truly lived underground, using methods unknown to modern man, and their traces remain so elusive that anyone who encounters them leaves feeling as if they have touched a secret that the earth is slow to reveal. The mystery of the ancient masters of Malawi. As they took their first steps across the rolling hills of Malawi, the research team realized that local tales of strange rock surfaces were no exaggeration, for right before them lay a wide gray slab, cut so smoothly that it seemed the rock itself had yielded to a strange will rather than cracking from heat and wind. The edge of this fracture was strikingly precise, reminiscent of the mark of a huge tool capable of cutting the rock like dense fabric. The longer the team studied the surface, the clearer it became that this was no simple crack, for along the entire length of the fracture ran thin parallel lines, slanting at the same angle. These lines did not appear to be traces of weathering or random chipping, as each one replicated the next with such precision as if an invisible hand had drawn a huge blade across the massif, leaving a rhythm that nature could not reproduce. A second layer was discovered nearby, tilted as if specially aligned to connect with the first, and the boundary between the layers formed a clear triangular outline, perfect to such an extent that it became clear to the researchers that they were looking at a fragment of structures that had a purpose and a plan, although no known cultures of the region left a legacy capable of explaining the presence of such geometrically strict elements. Further down the slope, a wall opened up, going vertically downwards to such a great depth that the light from the lanterns barely reached the middle, and the surface of the wall was covered with perfect round depressions, similar to the marks of a tool capable of rotating at a constant speed. But the depressions themselves did not show signs of overheating or friction, and this immediately destroyed all attempts to explain what was happening by the use of brute force. When attempting to take a sample, the stone split as if there were invisible directions within it that determined the crack's path in advance. Such an internal structure cannot be random, since natural rock always breaks unpredictably. Here, however, the fractures ran precisely along a designated line, as if the massif had once been subjected to gentle heating or other processing that altered its internal properties. A small depression between the massifs revealed yet another layer of mystery. a surface composed of enormous slabs so perfectly joined that it was impossible to fit even a blade of grass between them, and the joints repeated the same pattern as if the tiles were part of a common platform that had managed to survive the disappearance of the culture to which it belonged, and retained traces of knowledge that modern masters could only dream of. Several slabs had neat grooves of equal depth, as if supports had once stood on them, but not a single piece of wood or hint of metal remained of the supports themselves. And if the structure had really existed, it must have been so massive that the damage from its fall would have been noticeable, but the site remained surprisingly clean, as if everything had disappeared at once and without a trace. The explorer, who was the first to venture further toward the small drop, saw a narrow entrance, partially blocked by stone, and inside a tunnel with smooth walls carved into the shape of an elongated arc, so perfect that it seemed as if someone had created this arch, not with a tool, but with a system that allowed the rock to be reshaped from the inside without leaving the usual traces of processing. The air inside the tunnel was noticeably cooler than outside, though the exchange should have been minimal, and this coolness did not feel like dampness, but rather like a gentle flow coming from the depths, as if the space had its own ventilation system, hidden under layers of stone and operating without visible openings, which gave the feeling that the tunnel was not abandoned, but continued to interact with natural forces. A tap on the wall produced a vibration that traveled into the distance in a steady stream, without disintegrating into chaotic reflections. This acoustics is more suited to intentionally constructed objects than to natural formations, meaning that the tunnel's creators understood the properties of sound better than is generally believed for cultures that have left no traces of technological development. Higher up the slope lay fragments of another massif, the surface of which reflected the moonlight as if it were covered with a thin film capable of retaining its shine. And although the stone had spent thousands of years under the open sky, the gloss remained as if the surface had been polished to a state inaccessible to ordinary manual labor. And this reflection changed at different angles of illumination, creating patterns that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Some local families told legends of craftsmen who could soften stone using a secret mixture passed down only to a select few. And this legend was considered myth for decades until researchers saw smooth arcs, precise grooves, and perfect joints, so unlike human interaction with stone that it seemed as if the craftsman actually had a way to change the structure of the rock without brute force. The far part of the area held a particularly strange picture. A series of vertical faults formed a narrow corridor leading downwards, and the walls of the fault were dotted with barely noticeable notches, similar to traces of uniform vibrations, as if the stone had been subjected to vibrations, and these notches formed a pattern that was impossible to understand. But it was clear that its application was deliberate. Each new discovery only reinforced the feeling that the ancient Malawian craftsmen possessed knowledge that was incompatible with the known level of development of this region, as surfaces, lines, openings, joints, arches, and cool tunnels formed a structure that resembled the elements of a system created according to a deliberate plan, the purpose of which remains hidden. Today, the mystery of Malawi's ancient masters remains one of the most elusive of all mysteries, because each fragment of stone reveals a precision alien to natural processes and beyond the bounds of known technology. Every researcher standing among the perfectly smooth slabs understands that before them are not simply traces of the past, but the shadow of lost knowledge lingering in the stone, which time has not destroyed, but merely hidden deeper. Looking back on everything we've discussed today, each of these mysteries remains a reminder that the world holds more secrets than we're accustomed to admit. For beneath the water, in the depths of the earth, among the hills and forgotten valleys, traces of cultures whose knowledge has vanished along with those who possessed it continue to exist, and every stone, pattern, corridor, or strange vibration reminds us that the past doesn't always defy explanation, because it hides in places where logic gives way to the feeling that time has left us not answers, but only a direction in which to continue searching.